The most fundamental misunderstanding in contemporary American political economy is not about taxation, nor about regulation, nor even about the size of government. It is about the nature of subsidy itself. The average American citizen moves through an entire lifetime subsidized at nearly every inflection point of their economic existence, without ever developing a conscious awareness that subsidization is occurring. This is not an accident. It is the product of more than 2 centuries of deliberate institutional design, legislative obfuscation, and ideological framing that has rendered the subsidy apparatus of the United States government functionally invisible to the very populations it serves. The architecture of this invisibility is arguably the single greatest achievement of American governance, not because it is democratic and not because it is efficient, but because it has succeeded in constructing a consumer class that genuinely believes it is self-made, self-funded, and self-sustaining, when in material reality, the scaffolding of that class's existence is almost entirely erected and maintained by state intervention. To fully appreciate the depth and sophistication of this architecture, one must abandon the conventional frameworks through which government is typically understood, the liberal framework of benevolent intervention, and the conservative framework of government overreach, and instead adopt a structural lens that views subsidy not as an exception to the normal functioning of markets, but as the very foundation upon which those markets are built. To understand how this system operates, one must begin not with policy, but with epistemology, with the question of how citizens come to know what they know about their own economic lives. The dominant framework through which Americans interpret their relationship to the economy is what political scientists have called market fundamentalism, or more precisely, what the sociologist Fred Bloch termed the free market ideology. This ideology holds that economic outcomes are primarily the result of individual effort operating within a neutral, self-regulating market mechanism. Under this framework, the role of the government is understood to be minimal, limited to defense, basic infrastructure, and the enforcement of contracts. Everything else, housing, education, healthcare, food, transportation, retirement, is presumed to be the product of private initiative meeting market demand. This presumption is not merely wrong, it is the precise inversion of reality. The United States government is, and has been, since at least the passage of the Homestead Act of 1862, the single largest subsidizer of middle-class life in the history of the modern world. The mechanisms through which this subsidization occurs are so deeply embedded in the structure of everyday economic transactions that they have become indistinguishable from the market itself. The epistemological problem is therefore not one of information but of perception. The information is available to anyone who looks for it, but the perceptual frameworks through which Americans understand economic life are constructed in such a way as to render the information invisible even when it is directly encountered. A homeowner who deducts mortgage interest on their tax return is encountering a government subsidy in the most direct possible way, and yet the framing of the deduction, as a reduction in tax liability rather than as a government benefit, ensures that the encounter produces no cognitive recognition of subsidization. The homeowner perceives themselves as keeping more of their own money, not as receiving a government transfer. This perceptual inversion is the master technique of the American subsidy state, and it operates across every domain of economic life. Consider the most elemental unit of middle-class identity in America, homeownership. The average American homeowner does not perceive themselves as a recipient of government subsidy. They perceive themselves as a participant in a private market transaction. They found a house, negotiated a price, secured a mortgage from a private lender, and made monthly payments from their earned income. At no point in this narrative does the government appear as an active participant. And yet, the entire transaction is saturated with federal intervention at every level. The mortgage itself is almost certainly guaranteed by one of the government-sponsored enterprises. Fannie Mae, the Federal National Mortgage Association, established in 1938 as part of the New Deal, or Freddie Mac, the Federal Home Loan Mortgage Corporation, established in 1970 under the Emergency Home Finance Act, signed by Richard Nixon. These entities do not lend money directly to home buyers. Instead, they purchase mortgages from private lenders, thereby freeing up capital for those lenders to issue additional mortgages. This secondary mortgage market is the single mechanism that makes the 30-year fixed-rate mortgage possible. Without it, private lenders would bear the full risk of long-term lending and would either refuse to offer 30-year terms or would price them at rates that would render homeownership inaccessible to the vast majority of the population. The 30-year fixed-rate mortgage, the instrument that most Americans consider the natural default form of home financing, is, in fact, a government invention. It does not exist in most other countries. In Canada, the longest standard mortgage term is 5 years. In the United Kingdom, most mortgages reset every 2 to 5 years. In Germany, 10-year fixed terms are common, but 30-year terms are virtually unknown. The American 30-year fixed-rate mortgage is a product of government engineering, maintained by government-sponsored enterprises, backed by government guarantees, and subsidized through the tax code. It is a subsidy disguised as a product, And it is so thoroughly naturalized in American economic life that questioning its existence feels like questioning the law of gravity. But the subsidization does not stop at the structure of the loan. The interest paid on that mortgage is tax deductible under Section 163H of the Internal Revenue Code, a provision that has been in place in various forms since the introduction of the federal income tax in 1913. This deduction is worth, on average, thousands of dollars per year to homeowners, with the benefit skewing dramatically toward higher income households who have larger mortgages, higher marginal tax rates, and therefore larger deductions. The Congressional Budget Office has estimated that the mortgage interest deduction costs the federal government approximately $25 to $30 billion per year in foregone revenue. This is a direct transfer of wealth from the general tax base, which includes renters who receive no comparable benefit, to homeowners. It is, by any rigorous economic definition, a subsidy, and yet it is almost never discussed in those terms. It is discussed, when it is discussed at all, as a tax benefit or a deduction, language that frames the homeowner as someone who is simply keeping more of their own money, rather than as someone who is receiving a government benefit funded by the taxes of others. The linguistic architecture here is not incidental. The choice to call government transfers, delivered through the tax code deductions or credits rather than subsidies or benefits, is a political choice, made and reinforced over decades by legislators, lobbyists, and media figures who understand that the label attached to a policy determines whether it is perceived as an entitlement or an achievement. The homeowner who deducts their mortgage interest feels that they have earned something. The food stamp recipient who receives a government benefit feels that they have been given something. The economic mechanics are identical. In both cases, the government is transferring resources to an individual, but the psychological and political consequences are opposite. The property itself, the land on which the house sits, is also a product of subsidy, though the temporal distance between the original subsidy and the current transaction has rendered this connection invisible. The vast majority of privately held land in the United States was at some point distributed by the federal government through one of several massive land grant programs. The Homestead Act of 1862, signed by Abraham Lincoln in the midst of the Civil War, distributed approximately 270 million acres of public land, roughly 10% of the total area of the United States, to individual settlers for free or at nominal cost. The conditions were minimal. The settler had to be at least 21 years old, had to build a dwelling and cultivate the land, and had to reside on the claim for 5 years. After meeting these conditions, the settler received a patent, a deed of ownership, from the federal government. This was, by any standard, one of the largest wealth transfers in human history. The United States government gave away an area roughly equal to the combined landmass of France and Germany to approximately 1.6 million individual homesteaders. The wealth generated by this transfer, through agricultural production, mineral extraction, timber harvesting, and eventually urban development, is incalculable, and it has been compounded across generations through inheritance, sale, and reinvestment. The descendants of Homestead Act beneficiaries who retained their land and passed it down through their families are, in many cases, sitting on assets worth millions of dollars. Assets whose origin is a government giveaway that occurred more than a century ago. This is the deepest layer of the American subsidy state, a layer of wealth creation that is so old, so thoroughly integrated into the fabric of private property, that it has been completely forgotten as a government intervention. It is treated as primordial, as natural, as the baseline against which all subsequent government action is measured. But it is not natural. It is a subsidy. The Morrill Land Grant Acts of 1862 and 1890 transferred millions of additional acres to states for the purpose of establishing public universities. These land grant universities, including institutions that are now among the most prestigious and economically significant in the country, such as MIT, Cornell, the University of California system, the University of Wisconsin, and dozens of flagship state universities, were built on federally subsidized land and funded by the proceeds of the sale of that land. The connection between the federal land grant and the university that exists today is not merely historical, it is constitutive. Without the land grant, these institutions would not exist, or would exist in radically different form. The education they provide, the credentials, the research, the human capital development, is built on a foundation of federal subsidy that has been naturalized to the point of invisibility. When a student graduates from a land-grant university with an engineering degree and secures a high-paying job in the private sector, they do not perceive themselves as a beneficiary of federal subsidy. They perceive themselves as a meritocratic achiever who earned their degree through hard work and talent, and their hard work and talent are real. But the institution that validated their work and credentialed their talent exists because the federal government gave away millions of acres of land that had been taken, in most cases, from indigenous peoples through a combination of treaties, coercion, and military force to create it. The subsidy is at the foundation, and everything built on top of it is, in a structural sense, subsidized. The Pacific Railroad Acts of the 1860s granted enormous tracts of land to railroad companies, approximately 175 million acres in total, an area larger than the state of Texas, along with federal bonds and other financial support, to incentivize the construction of the transcontinental railroad. The railroad companies sold parcels of this land to settlers along their routes, creating the towns and cities that would become the economic geography of the American West. The railroads themselves became the backbone of the American industrial economy, facilitating the movement of goods, people, and capital across the continent at speeds and scales that were previously impossible. The wealth generated by the railroads, and by the towns, farms, mines, and industries that grew up along their routes, is a direct product of federal subsidy. The railroad companies did not build the Transcontinental Railroad through private initiative alone. They built it with land, money, and political support provided by the federal government. And the economic geography they created, the cities, the towns, the agricultural regions, the mining districts, continues to shape the distribution of wealth and opportunity in America today. Every parcel of land in the United States that was once part of these distributions carries within it the residue of federal subsidy, a subsidy that has been capitalized, compounded, and inherited across generations, accumulating value that is now treated as purely private wealth. The transformation of government-granted land into private wealth is perhaps the most consequential subsidy in American history, and it is also the most invisible because it occurred so long ago that the origin has been erased from collective memory. The homeowner also benefits from the implicit subsidy of municipal infrastructure, roads, water systems, sewage treatment, fire protection, police services, that is funded through a combination of local property taxes, state transfers, and federal grants. The federal government's role in funding local infrastructure is massive but largely invisible to the end user. The Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, signed by President Dwight Eisenhower, created the Interstate Highway System, the largest public works project in American history, funded at 90% by the federal government through the Highway Trust Fund, which is itself funded by the federal gasoline tax. The original authorization was for 41,000 miles of limited access highways connecting every major city in the United States at a cost that would eventually exceed $500 billion in inflation-adjusted terms. The interstate highway system did not merely facilitate transportation, it fundamentally restructured the geography of American life, making suburban homeownership possible by connecting peripheral residential areas to urban employment centers. The suburbs that Americans take for granted, the subdivisions, the strip malls, the office parks, the cul-de-sacs, are artifacts of the interstate highway system. They could not exist without it. The suburban homeowner who commutes to work on an interstate highway is, in a very direct sense, living a life that was designed, funded, and physically constructed by the federal government. But the ideological framing of American economic life has been so successful in rendering government intervention invisible that this same homeowner is likely to describe themselves as a self-reliant taxpayer who resents government spending and opposes government intervention in the economy. The invisibility of subsidy is not merely a matter of ignorance or lack of information. It is actively produced through a set of institutional mechanisms that political scientist Suzanne Mettler has called the submerged state. Mettler's concept, developed in her 2011 book of the same name, identifies a specific category of government policies that deliver benefits through the tax code, through private intermediaries, or through regulatory structures rather than through direct government payments. These policies are submerged in the sense that they are invisible to their beneficiaries. The beneficiaries interact with private sector entities, such as banks, insurance companies, employers, and universities, and never encounter the government as the source of the benefit they are receiving. The submerged state includes not only the mortgage interest deduction, but also the employer-sponsored health insurance exclusion, which costs the federal government over $300 billion per year in foregone revenue. The tax-advantaged status of 401k and IRA retirement accounts, costing approximately $200 billion per year, the Earned Income Tax Credit, the Child Tax Credit, the Student Loan Interest Deduction, the American Opportunity Tax Credit for higher education expenses, the exclusion of scholarship and fellowship income from taxation, the tax-free treatment of life insurance proceeds, the deductibility of state and local taxes, the preferential tax rates on capital gains and qualified dividends, and dozens of other provisions that collectively constitute the largest transfer of resources from the federal government to individual citizens. But these transfers are experienced by those citizens not as government benefits, but as features of the private market, as reductions in their tax bill, as benefits provided by their employer, as interest rates set by their bank, as prices determined by the market. The government is the silent partner in every one of these transactions, and its silence is the condition of its political survival. The political consequences of this invisibility are profound and deeply researched. Mettler's empirical work has demonstrated that citizens who benefit from submerged state policies are significantly less likely to report that they have ever used a government social program than citizens who benefit from visible programs like supplemental nutrition assistance, program benefits, temporary assistance for needy families, or public housing. In a nationally representative survey, 60% of respondents who claimed the mortgage interest deduction said they had never used a government social program. 53% of those who had received employer-sponsored health insurance said the same. 44% of Social Security beneficiaries, recipients of the most explicitly governmental program in American life, said they had never used a government social program. And 40% of Medicare beneficiaries, whose health care is entirely funded and administered by the federal government, said they had never used a government social program. These numbers are not the product of dishonesty or hypocrisy. They are the product of a system that has been designed, deliberately, over decades, to prevent its beneficiaries from recognizing themselves as beneficiaries. The perceptual gap between the submerged state and the visible state is the foundation of American political dysfunction around the question of government spending. Citizens who do not perceive themselves as beneficiaries of government spending are far more likely to support cuts to government spending, cuts that would, in many cases, directly reduce their own benefits. The result is a political landscape in which the largest beneficiaries of government subsidy are also the most vocal opponents of government subsidy, not because they are hypocrites, but because the system has been designed to prevent them from recognizing themselves as beneficiaries. This is the master paradox of the American subsidy state, and it is a paradox that has been exploited by political actors across the ideological spectrum for generations. This design is not the product of a single conspiracy or a unified plan. It is the accumulated result of decades of legislative compromise, ideological contestation, and institutional path dependence. The preference for submerged state mechanisms over direct government provision has deep roots in American political culture, which has historically been more comfortable with government intervention that operates through private sector channels than with government intervention that is visibly and explicitly governmental. This cultural predisposition has its origins in the unique circumstances of American state formation, the absence of a feudal past, the mythology of the frontier, the decentralized federal structure, the early and widespread extension of white male suffrage, and the racial politics that have shaped American conceptions of government from the founding to the present. Political scientists have long noted that American opposition to visible government benefits is strongly correlated with the racial composition of the perceived beneficiary population. When government benefits are perceived as flowing to white, middle-class populations, as with Social Security, Medicare, the mortgage interest deduction, and the GI Bill, they receive broad political support. When government benefits are perceived as flowing to minority populations, as with welfare, food stamps, Medicaid, and public housing, they are stigmatized, underfunded, and politically vulnerable. The submerged state exploits this racial dynamic by delivering benefits to the disproportionately white, middle, and upper middle class through invisible mechanisms, while leaving benefits to the disproportionately non-white, poor, invisible, stigmatized programs. The architecture of invisible subsidy is therefore not racially neutral. It is racially structured, and its racial structure is one of the key mechanisms through which racial wealth disparities are maintained and reproduced across generations. The preference for submerged state mechanisms was reinforced by the political dynamics of the New Deal era, when Franklin Roosevelt's advisors recognized that programs delivered through private employers, like employer-sponsored health insurance, which was encouraged through wartime wage controls and then codified through the Revenue Act of 1954, would be more politically durable than programs delivered directly by the government because they would create constituencies, employers, insurance companies, financial institutions, that would lobby for the continuation of the programs. This was a deliberate strategy of political camouflage. By embedding government benefits within private sector transactions, policymakers ensured that those benefits would be defended not by their recipients, who did not know they were receiving them, but by the private sector intermediaries who profited from delivering them. The insurance industry lobbies for the continuation of the employer health insurance exclusion, not because it cares about the health of workers, but because the exclusion channels 200 million Americans into employer-sponsored insurance plans administered by private insurance companies. The financial services industry lobbies for the continuation of tax-advantaged retirement accounts, not because it cares about the retirement security of workers, but because those accounts channel trillions of dollars into mutual funds, index funds, and other financial products managed by private financial institutions. The real estate industry lobbies for the continuation of the mortgage interest deduction, not because it cares about home ownership, but because the deduction inflates home prices and increases the volume of home sales, both of which increase the commissions and fees earned by real estate agents, mortgage brokers, and title companies. The submerged state has created an ecosystem of private sector beneficiaries who have a powerful financial interest in preventing the subsidies from becoming visible, because visibility would expose the subsidies to political scrutiny, public debate, and potential reform. The depth of this camouflage extends into the very language of American economic discourse. The word subsidy itself has been politically weaponized to refer only to benefits that flow to populations deemed undeserving: welfare recipients, farmers in certain contexts, foreign governments, green energy companies, public transit systems. When benefits flow to the middle class through the tax code or through private intermediaries, they are called incentives, deductions, credits, relief, or simply the way things work. This linguistic asymmetry is not accidental. It is the product of decades of political framing by both parties, though it has been most aggressively deployed by the conservative movement since the rise of the New Right in the 1970s. The consequence is that the word subsidy has become associated in the public mind with dependency, inefficiency, and moral failure, associations that make it almost impossible to have a rational public conversation about the actual structure of government support for the middle class. When a politician proposes a new subsidy for childcare, the proposal is immediately subjected to a discourse of dependency. Will it discourage work? Will it create a culture of entitlement? Will it expand the government beyond its proper role? These questions are never asked about the mortgage interest deduction, the employer health insurance exclusion, or the capital gains preference, even though these provisions are subsidies of vastly greater magnitude. The linguistic architecture of subsidy discourse is a political technology, a tool for determining which government benefits are legitimate and which are suspect, and it operates with remarkable effectiveness across the American political landscape. The scale of the submerged state is staggering when measured in aggregate. The Tax Policy Center estimates that tax expenditures, the technical term for revenue losses attributable to provisions of the tax code that provide preferential treatment to specific activities or groups, totaled approximately $1.8 trillion in recent fiscal years. To put this in perspective, total discretionary federal spending, the budget category that includes defense, education, transportation, scientific research, and all other non-entitlement programs, was approximately $1.7 trillion in the same period. The government spends more through the tax code, through deductions, exclusions, credits, and preferential rates, than it spends through its entire discretionary budget. This is an extraordinary fact that deserves sustained reflection. The largest component of government spending in the United States is invisible. It does not appear in the budget as a line item. It is not debated during the appropriations process. It is not subject to sequestration or continuing resolutions. It grows automatically as incomes and asset prices increase, and its beneficiaries are overwhelmingly concentrated in the upper half of the income distribution. The top quintile of earners receives approximately 50% of all tax expenditure benefits. The bottom quintile receives approximately 3%. The submerged state is, in aggregate, a massive upward redistribution mechanism, a system that transfers resources from the general public to the affluent while maintaining the ideological fiction that the affluent are self-made and that government benefits flow primarily to the poor. This is the architecture of invisible subsidy, a system so deeply embedded in the structure of American economic life that it has become indistinguishable from the economy itself. It operates through the tax code, through government-sponsored enterprises, through regulatory mandates, through federally backed insurance programs, through land grants that predate living memory, through infrastructure projects that have been naturalized into the landscape, and through a political discourse that has been carefully calibrated to prevent its own recognition. The average American citizen is born in a hospital whose construction was partially funded by federal Hill-Burton Act grants, delivered by a physician whose medical education was subsidized by federal funding to medical schools and teaching hospitals, educated in a public school funded by a combination of local property taxes and federal Title I funds, fed by a school lunch program established by the National School Lunch Act of 1946, trained at a university subsidized by federal Pell Grants and state appropriations, derived in part from Morrill Act land, carrying student debt that is federally guaranteed and subsidized through income-driven repayment plans, employed at a company whose existence depends on limited liability laws and intellectual property protections enforced by the federal government, insured through an employer-sponsored plan whose tax-advantaged status constitutes a federal subsidy of more than $300 billion per year, housed in a home financed by a government-guaranteed mortgage with tax-deductible interest on a street paved with funds that include federal transportation grants, driving on a federally funded highway in a car whose safety standards are set by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, and whose fuel is made affordable by a combination of oil industry subsidies and military expenditures to secure global petroleum supply lines, eating food made affordable by agricultural subsidies authorized by the Farm Bill, drinking water treated to standards set by the Safe Drinking Water Act, and delivered through infrastructure funded in part by EPA grants, saving for retirement in a tax-advantaged account administered by a financial institution that is itself regulated, insured, and backstopped by the federal government, and will eventually retire on Social Security and Medicare, Two programs that, despite being entirely government-created and government-funded, are perceived by many beneficiaries as earned entitlements rather than government benefits because of the payroll tax mechanism through which they are funded, which creates the illusion of a personal account rather than a transfer payment. Every stage of this life cycle is subsidized, and at every stage, the subsidy is invisible. The invisibility is not a bug, it is the feature. It is the design. It is the architecture. Understanding this architecture is not merely an academic exercise. It is a prerequisite for understanding every major policy debate in contemporary American politics, from healthcare reform to housing affordability to student debt to retirement security to infrastructure spending to tax reform to climate policy to industrial policy to trade policy. Every one of these debates is, at its core, a debate about the structure and distribution of subsidy. But because the existing subsidy structure is invisible, these debates are conducted as though they are debates about whether the government should intervene in the economy, rather than debates about how the government should intervene in the economy, which is the only honest framing because the government is already intervening in the economy at every level. The question is never whether to subsidize. The question is always who to subsidize, through what mechanism, and at whose expense. The architecture of invisible subsidy ensures that this question is almost never asked directly. And that is perhaps its most consequential function. By preventing the question from being asked, the architecture ensures that the existing distribution of subsidies, which overwhelmingly favors the affluent, the asset-owning, and the politically connected, is perpetuated without scrutiny, without debate, and without accountability. The invisible subsidy state is a democracy-resistant structure. It persists not because the public endorses it, but because the public cannot see it. The implications extend beyond domestic policy into the realm of international comparison and geopolitical strategy. When American policymakers criticize other nations, China, the European Union, Japan, South Korea, developing countries seeking industrial policy, for subsidizing their industries or their citizens, they are engaging in a form of strategic amnesia that erases the massive subsidy apparatus that undergirds the American economy. The United States subsidizes its agricultural sector through the Farm Bill at approximately $20 billion per year in direct payments, crop insurance subsidies, and conservation payments, with additional billions in indirect subsidies through trade protections, ethanol mandates, and water subsidies for irrigation. It subsidizes its fossil fuel industry through a combination of tax preferences, including the intangible drilling costs, deduction, the percentage depletion allowance, the manufacturing deduction for oil and gas, below-market royalty rates on federal land and offshore leases, and externalized environmental costs estimated at $20 billion or more per year by the International Monetary Fund. It subsidizes its defense industry through a procurement system that guarantees profits on cost-plus contracts and through a revolving door between the Pentagon and defense contractors that ensures favorable treatment in contract awards. It subsidizes its technology sector through federally funded basic research conducted at universities and national laboratories, research that produced the internet through DARPA funding, GPS through Air Force satellite programs, touchscreen technology through CIA-funded research, mRNA vaccine technology through NIH grants, and the algorithms underlying modern artificial intelligence through decades of NSF and DARPA funding in computer science and machine learning. It subsidizes its financial sector through the Federal Reserve's lender of last resort function, through FDIC deposit insurance funded by bank premiums, but backstopped by the full faith and credit of the United States, through the implicit guarantee that systemically important financial institutions will be bailed out in a crisis, a guarantee that was made explicit in 2008 and that permanently reduced the cost of capital for the largest banks relative to their smaller competitors. It subsidizes its pharmaceutical industry through patent protections that grant monopoly pricing power for 20 years, through Medicare Part D's prohibition on government negotiation of drug prices, through NIH-funded basic research that is then commercialized by private companies at enormous profit. The United States is not a free market economy that occasionally intervenes to correct market failures. It is a comprehensively subsidized economy that maintains the ideological appearance of a free market. The gap between appearance and reality is the architecture of invisible subsidy, and it is the subject of this analysis. What follows in the subsequent 99 sections of this work is an attempt to make the invisible visible, to trace the specific mechanisms, historical origins, political dynamics, and economic consequences of the American subsidy state in granular, technical, and unflinching detail. We will examine the Federal Reserve's role as the ultimate subsidizer of capital markets. We will trace the legislative history of the tax code's preferential treatment of investment income, employer-sponsored benefits, and home ownership. We will analyze the structure of government-sponsored enterprises, from Fannie Mae to the Federal Home Loan Banks to the Farm Credit System. We will examine the subsidy embedded in the student loan system, the healthcare system, the insurance industry, the underwriting mechanisms that distribute risk from private actors to public institutions, and the agricultural sector. We will explore the hidden subsidies in the gig economy, how companies like Lyft and Uber subsidize drivers through bonus structures that are themselves funded by venture capital, that is itself subsidized through carried interest provisions and capital gains preferences. We will examine how private equity and venture capital deploy government-subsidized capital to restructure industries, extract value, and concentrate wealth. We will trace the political economy of subsidy, how different administrations, from Lincoln to Roosevelt to Eisenhower to Johnson to Reagan to Clinton to Obama to Trump, have used the subsidy apparatus to advance different visions of the American economy and the American class structure. We will examine the role of subsidy in higher education, how the Pell Grant, the Stafford Loan, the GI Bill, and the Tax Advantage 529 plan have collectively created a system that subsidizes credential acquisition while simultaneously inflating the cost of credentials. We will examine insurance as a subsidy mechanism, how the National Flood Insurance Program, the Federal Crop Insurance Program, the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, and the Terrorism Risk Insurance backstop all function as government subsidies to specific industries and populations while being framed as market mechanisms. And throughout, we will attend to the sociology and psychology of subsidy, to the ways in which the invisibility of subsidy shapes not only policy outcomes, but the very consciousness of the citizens who live within the subsidized world, the consumer adoption mechanisms through which subsidized products become naturalized as market offerings, and the ideological frameworks through which citizens interpret their own economic lives in ways that systematically obscure the role of government in producing those lives. This is not a polemic. It is a forensic examination of a system that is hiding in plain sight. The goal is not to argue that subsidies are good or bad, though judgments about their distribution and consequences are inevitable and will be made explicit where appropriate, but to make the system legible, because a system that cannot be seen, cannot be reformed, cannot be debated, and cannot be held accountable to democratic deliberation. The architecture of invisible subsidy is the architecture of American political economy itself, and understanding it is the first step toward understanding everything else that follows. Every policy debate, every electoral contest, every budget negotiation, every claim about self-reliance, every accusation of dependency, and every argument about the proper role of government in a society that has never, at any point in its history, operated without massive, pervasive, and continuous government subsidy of its citizens, its industries, and its economic order. The invisible subsidy state is not a distortion of American capitalism. It is American capitalism. It is the engine that created the middle class, the mechanism that maintains the middle class, and the system whose distributional choices determine who enters the middle class, who remains in the middle class, and who is excluded from the middle class entirely. The question that animates this entire work is not whether the American economy is subsidized, it is comprehensively and without exception, but rather how the subsidy system is structured, who benefits, who pays, and why the system has been designed to be invisible to the very people whose lives it shapes. The answers to these questions are technical, historical, political, sociological, and psychological, and they require a mode of analysis that is comfortable moving between econometric data, legislative history, institutional analysis, political philosophy, racial and class dynamics, and the phenomenology of everyday economic experience. That is the mode of analysis this work will employ, beginning with the Federal Reserve and proceeding through every major domain of the American subsidy state, from the tax code to the insurance system to the gig economy, to the deployment of venture capital, until the entire architecture has been illuminated, rendered legible, and made fully available for the democratic scrutiny and public accountability it has so successfully, so thoroughly, and so consequentially evaded for well over a century and a half of continuous American democratic governance. No institution in the history of the American political economy has functioned as a more consequential, more pervasive, or more systematically misunderstood subsidizer than the Federal Reserve System. Established in 1913 through the Federal Reserve Act, signed by President Woodrow Wilson, the Fed was born out of the financial panic of 1907, a crisis that exposed the structural fragility of a banking system without a central lender of last resort. The panic began with the failure of the Knickerbocker Trust Company in New York, which triggered a cascading series of bank runs that spread across the country, freezing credit markets, collapsing stock prices, and threatening the solvency of otherwise healthy financial institutions. The crisis was eventually resolved not by government action, but by the personal intervention of J.P. Morgan, who organized a consortium of bankers to provide emergency liquidity to the system. An intervention that, while effective, demonstrated the absurdity and the danger of relying on a single private citizen to perform the function of a central bank. The National Monetary Commission, established by Congress in the wake of the panic under the leadership of Senator Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island, studied central banking systems around the world and produced a series of reports that laid the intellectual groundwork for the Federal Reserve Act. The official rationale for the Fed's creation was stabilization. It would provide an elastic currency that could expand and contract with the needs of commerce, and it would serve as a backstop for solvent banks facing temporary liquidity shortages. These functions are real, and they are important, but they represent only the surface layer of the Fed's actual role in the American economy. Beneath the technocratic language of monetary policy, interest rate targeting, open market operations, reserve requirements, quantitative easing, forward guidance, yield, curve control, lies a subsidy mechanism of almost incomprehensible scale, a mechanism that determines who gets access to cheap capital, who bears the cost of inflation, who accumulates wealth, and who is excluded from wealth accumulation. The Federal Reserve is not merely a regulator of the money supply, it is the architect of the capital structure of the United States and every decision it makes. Every basis point adjustment, every asset purchase, every emergency facility, every public statement about the likely path of future policy is a decision about who is subsidized and who is not. To understand the Fed as a subsidizer, one must first understand the mechanism through which it operates, the manipulation of interest rates. The federal funds rate, the rate at which depository institutions lend reserves to each other overnight, is the single most consequential price in the global economy. It is not merely an American price, because the dollar is the world's reserve currency, and because the vast majority of global commodities, including oil, are priced in dollars. The federal funds rate influences borrowing costs, asset prices, and capital flows in every country on earth. By setting this price, the Federal Open Market Committee determines the cost of borrowing for every actor in the American economy, from the largest Wall Street bank to the smallest consumer carrying a credit card balance, and for a vast number of actors in the global economy as well. When the FOMC lowers the federal funds rate, it is making borrowing cheaper. When it raises the rate, it is making borrowing more expensive. These are not neutral, technical adjustments. They are distributional decisions, decisions that transfer wealth between different groups in the economy, between borrowers and savers, between asset owners and wage earners, between the present and the future, between those with access to sophisticated capital markets and those without such access. The technocratic framing of monetary policy, with its charts, its dot plots, its carefully worded statements, its press conferences conducted by PhD economists speaking in measured tones about data dependency and dual mandates, obscures the fundamentally political nature of these distributional choices. Every interest rate decision is a political decision in the most basic sense. It determines who gets what, when, and how. But because the Fed is structured as an independent institution, insulated from direct democratic accountability, its governors are appointed for 14-year terms, its regional bank presidents are selected by boards dominated by private bankers, and its operations are largely exempt from congressional appropriations. These political decisions are made outside the democratic process and are shielded from the kind of public scrutiny that would be applied to equivalent decisions made by Congress or the executive branch. The distributional consequences of interest rate policy are perhaps the most systematically underappreciated feature of the American political economy. When the Fed lowers interest rates, the immediate beneficiaries are borrowers, corporations that issue bonds at lower yields, governments that sell treasuries at lower rates, households that take out mortgages and car loans at reduced interest charges. Lower rates reduce the cost of servicing existing variable rate debt and make new borrowing more attractive, stimulating demand for credit across the economy. But the deeper, more consequential beneficiaries of low interest rates are asset owners. This is because lower interest rates mechanically increase the present value of future cash flows, which means that all income-producing assets, stocks, bonds, real estate, private businesses, intellectual property, any claim on future earnings, increase in value when rates fall. This is not a secondary or incidental effect. It is a mathematical certainty derived from the most basic principles of finance. The net present value of any asset is calculated by discounting its expected future cash flows at the prevailing interest rate. When that rate falls, the discount factor decreases and the present value increases. A stock that is expected to generate $100 in earnings per year forever is worth $2,000 when the discount rate is 5%, but $5,000 when the discount rate is 2%. A 150% increase in value produced not by any change in the underlying productivity of the company, but solely by a change in the interest rate set by a committee of 12 people meeting 8 times per year in Washington, D.C. This is why stock markets rally when the Fed cuts rates and fall when the Fed raises rates. It is why real estate prices are inversely correlated with mortgage rates over long periods. It is why the period of historically low interest rates from 2009 to 2022, a period in which the federal funds rate was at or near zero for approximately 9 of 13 years, coincided with the most dramatic increase in asset prices, and therefore in wealth inequality, in modern American history. The numbers are staggering and deserve careful enumeration. Between the fourth quarter of 2008, when the Fed began its first round of quantitative easing in response to the global financial crisis, and the first quarter of 2022, when it began raising rates in response to post-pandemic inflation, the S&P 500 index increased from approximately 900 to approximately 4,500, a 5-fold increase in the market value of the largest publicly traded companies in America. The NASDAQ composite, heavily weighted toward technology companies, increased from approximately 1,500 to approximately 14,000, a more than ninefold increase. Total U.S. household net worth, as measured by the Federal Reserve's own flow of funds data, increased from approximately $56 trillion to approximately $150 trillion over the same period, an increase of nearly $100 trillion in aggregate household wealth. But this increase was not distributed evenly, not even close. The Federal Reserve's triennial survey of consumer finances, the most comprehensive data set on the distribution of household wealth in the United States, reveals that the top 10% of households by wealth own approximately 89% of all stock market wealth and approximately 75% of all non-home real estate. The top 1% alone owns approximately 54% of all stock market wealth. The bottom 50% of households, approximately 65 million families, own approximately 1% of stock market wealth and a negligible share of investment real estate. When the Fed's low interest rate policy caused asset prices to increase by tens of trillions of dollars, those gains flowed overwhelmingly to households that were already wealthy. The bottom half of the wealth distribution received almost nothing from what was, in dollar terms, the single largest wealth creation event in American history. This was not an unintended consequence, and it was not a failure of the policy. It was a structural feature of a policy that was explicitly designed to operate through asset price channels, to raise asset prices in order to create a wealth effect that would stimulate consumer spending. The design assumed that the benefits would trickle down from asset owners to non-asset owners through increased economic activity. Whether that trickle-down occurred, and the evidence suggests that it was, at best, modest, does not change the distributional reality. The direct first-order effect of the Fed's policy was a massive transfer of wealth to the already wealthy. The mechanism deserves further technical elaboration because its specificity is what makes it simultaneously so powerful and so invisible. When the FOMC decides to lower the federal funds rate, it does so by instructing the open market trading desk at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York to purchase U.S. Treasury securities and, in some periods, agency mortgage-backed securities in the open market. These purchases are conducted through a network of approximately 24 primary dealers, large financial institutions including J.P. Morgan Chase, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, Bank of America Securities, Citigroup Global Markets, Barclays Capital, Deutsche Bank Securities, and others, that are authorized to transact directly with the Fed. The primary dealer system was established in the 1960s and formalized in the 1970s as a mechanism for ensuring orderly government securities markets. In practice, it functions as a government-granted franchise, a club of elite financial institutions that enjoy privileged access to the central bank's operations and that earn profits from that access. When the Fed buys securities from the primary dealers, it pays for those securities by crediting the reserve accounts of the primary dealers' banks at the Federal Reserve. This is, in the most literal sense imaginable, money creation. The Fed creates new reserves, new base money, electronically, and uses that money to buy financial assets from the largest financial institutions in the world. No taxes are collected, no appropriation is made by Congress, no democratic body authorizes the transaction. The Federal Reserve creates money and gives it to Wall Street in exchange for financial assets. The primary dealers then have additional reserves, which they can use to make loans, buy other assets, fund proprietary trading operations, or hold as excess reserves earning interest from the Fed. The effect is to flood the banking system with cheap money, driving down interest rates across the entire yield curve, from overnight rates to 30-year Treasury yields to corporate bond rates to mortgage rates. This process is a subsidy in multiple, overlapping senses that must be distinguished and analyzed separately. First, the primary dealers benefit directly from their privileged access to the Fed's operations. They earn bid-ask spreads on the securities they sell to the Fed, buying in the secondary market at one price and selling to the Fed at a slightly higher price. And they benefit from the advanced knowledge, or at minimum, the sophisticated probabilistic modeling of the Fed's purchasing patterns, timing, and quantities. Academic research, including work by economists at the Federal Reserve banks themselves, has documented that primary dealers consistently earn abnormal returns on the days surrounding FOMC announcements and open market operations, returns that are consistent with an informational advantage derived from their proximity to the central bank. The primary dealer system is, in effect, a government-created oligopoly that channels the benefits of monetary policy implementation through a small number of politically connected financial institutions before those benefits diffuse to the broader economy. The argument that the primary dealer system is necessary for market functioning, which it may be, does not change the fact that it is also a subsidy to the institutions that participate in it. Second, the banking system as a whole benefits from the reduction in funding costs that accompanies Fed easing. When the Fed floods the system with reserves, banks can borrow from each other more cheaply in the federal funds market, which means they can fund their lending operations at lower cost. This reduction in funding costs translates into higher net interest margins. the difference between the rate at which banks borrow from depositors, from the Fed, and from each other, and the rate at which they lend to consumers, businesses, and governments. The net interest margin is the primary driver of traditional banking profitability, and the Fed's interest rate policy directly determines its magnitude and structure. When the Fed keeps short-term rates low and the yield curve steep, meaning long-term rates are significantly higher than short-term rates, it is effectively subsidizing bank profits by allowing banks to borrow at near zero cost and lend at rates of 3, 4, 5, or 6%, depending on the credit risk of the borrower. During the period from 2009 to 2015, when the federal funds rate was effectively zero, the 6 largest U.S. banks, J.P. Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Citigroup, Wells Fargo, Goldman Sachs, and Morgan Stanley, earned aggregate net income of approximately $500 billion. A substantial portion of this profitability was directly attributable to the Fed's zero interest rate policy, which provided these institutions with nearly free funding. The banks did not create this profit through superior management or innovation. They earned it because the central bank set the price of their raw material, money, at zero. This is a subsidy by any definition, and it was worth billions of dollars per year to each of the largest banks. Third, and most consequentially for the distribution of wealth in America, the purchasers and holders of financial assets benefit from the Fed-induced increase in asset prices. When the Fed buys trillions of dollars of Treasury and mortgage-backed securities, it removes those securities from the market, reducing their available supply and increasing their price. Higher bond prices mean lower bond yields, which pushes investors out of bonds and into riskier assets: stocks, corporate bonds, high-yield debt, real estate, private equity, venture capital, cryptocurrency, and other speculative investments. This portfolio rebalancing effect is not a side effect of Fed policy. It is the explicit, stated goal. Former Fed Chair Ben Bernanke, the architect of quantitative easing, described the mechanism in a November 2010 op-ed in the Washington Post, writing that the Fed's asset purchases would work by raising asset prices, which would increase household wealth, which would increase consumer spending, which would create jobs and stimulate economic growth. This is the wealth effect theory. The proposition that when people feel wealthier because the value of their financial portfolios and real estate holdings has increased, they are more willing to spend money, and this additional spending creates demand that ripples through the economy, generating employment and income for workers who may not own any assets themselves. The theory is not entirely wrong. There is evidence that asset price increases do generate some additional consumer spending, but it contains a distributional assumption that is almost never made explicit in public discourse. The wealth effect operates only through the balance sheets of asset owners. For the approximately 40% of American households that have zero or negative net worth, that own no stocks, no investment real estate, no business equity, no bonds, no financial assets of any kind, the wealth effect is a meaningless abstraction. The Fed's policy enriches the asset-owning class and hopes, not guarantees, that some fraction of that enrichment will trickle down to the non-asset-owning class through increased economic activity. The structure is identical to supply-side economics, except that instead of tax cuts for the wealthy being the mechanism is asset price inflation for the wealthy. The Fed's monetary policy during this era was, in its essential structure, trickle-down economics administered by an independent central bank rather than by Congress. The quantitative easing programs that the Fed conducted between 2008 and 2022 represent the most explicit and large-scale example of central bank subsidization in American history, and quite possibly in the history of any nation. In QE1, launched in November 2008 and completed in June 2010, the Fed purchased approximately $1.75 trillion in Treasury securities, agency debt, and agency mortgage-backed securities. In QE2, from November 2010 to June 2011, it purchased an additional $600 billion in Treasuries. Operation Twist, conducted from September 2011 to December 2012, involved selling short-term Treasuries and buying long-term Treasuries to flatten the yield curve, with a total volume of approximately $667 billion. In QE3, the most aggressive program prior to the pandemic, the Fed purchased $85 billion per month in Treasuries and mortgage-backed securities from September 2012 until tapering began in January 2014, with total purchases of approximately $1.6 trillion. And then, in March 2020, when the COVID-19 pandemic triggered a sudden and severe financial market dislocation, the Fed launched what can only be described as unlimited quantitative easing, an open-ended commitment to buy Treasuries and mortgage-backed securities in whatever amounts were necessary to restore market functioning. In the space of approximately 2 years, the Fed expanded its balance sheet from approximately $4.2 trillion to approximately $8.96 trillion, an increase of $4.76 trillion. At its peak, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet represented approximately 37% of U.S. GDP, To put this in perspective, the Federal Reserve, a single institution governed by a board of 7 appointed officials and a committee of 12, held financial assets equal to more than 1/3 of the entire annual economic output of the United States. It had created trillions of dollars from nothing and used that money to purchase financial assets in markets dominated by the wealthiest individuals and institutions in the country. The scale of this intervention has no historical precedent in American economic history, and its distributional consequences, the enrichment of asset owners at the expense of savers, wage earners, and non-asset holders, were, at the time, largely unexamined by the mainstream media and the political class. The mortgage-backed securities purchases deserve special attention because they represent a direct, explicit, and architecturally specific subsidy to the housing market, and therefore to homeowners, to the real estate industry, to the mortgage origination and servicing industry, and to the financial institutions that securitize and trade mortgage-backed securities. When the Fed buys mortgage-backed securities that are pools of thousands of individual home mortgages packaged and sold by Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and Ginnie Mae, it increases demand for those securities, which raises their price and lowers their yield. Because mortgage rates are closely tied to the yield on agency MBS, the Fed's purchases directly reduce the interest rates that borrowers pay on new mortgages and that existing borrowers pay when they refinance. The difference between what mortgage rates would be without Fed purchases and what they actually are with Fed purchases is the subsidy. Estimates of this subsidy vary depending on the methodology and the period studied, but research from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and from academic economists suggests that the Fed's MBS purchases reduced mortgage rates by approximately 50 to 150 basis points during periods of active purchasing. On a $300,000 mortgage, a reduction of 100 basis points, 1 full percentage point, saves the borrower approximately $175 per month, or approximately $63,000 over the life of a 30-year loan. Multiply this by the approximately 50 million outstanding mortgages in the United States, and the aggregate subsidy is enormous, conservatively hundreds of billions of dollars in reduced interest payments, funded not by congressional appropriation and not by tax revenue, but by the Fed's unique and extraordinary power to create money out of nothing and use it to buy financial assets in the open market. But who actually benefits from this mortgage subsidy? The answer reveals the perverse distributional logic of the Fed's housing market intervention. Renters, who constitute approximately 36% of American households and who are disproportionately lower income, disproportionately younger, and disproportionately Black and Hispanic, do not have mortgages and therefore receive no direct benefit from the Fed's MBS purchases. Prospective first-time homebuyers face a paradox. While lower mortgage rates reduce the monthly cost of servicing a given loan amount, the same lower rates increase housing demand, which drives up home prices. The net effect on affordability for first-time buyers is ambiguous at best and negative at worst. The empirical literature suggests that the price effect tends to dominate the rate effect, meaning that the Fed's MBS purchases actually make homeownership less affordable for people who do not already own homes. The primary beneficiaries are existing homeowners who can refinance their existing mortgages at lower rates, capturing the rate reduction without facing the price increase since they already own their home, and real estate investors who benefit from higher property values. And because homeownership rates and home values are strongly and persistently correlated with income, wealth, and race, the homeownership rate for white households is approximately 74%, compared to approximately 44% for Black households and 48% for Hispanic households. The median home value for white homeowners is substantially higher than for minority homeowners. The benefits of the Fed's mortgage market subsidy are concentrated among the already affluent and the already white. This is not a politically motivated observation. It is a mathematical consequence of applying a subsidization mechanism to an asset class whose ownership is sharply stratified by income, wealth, and race. The Fed's role as subsidizer extends beyond interest rates and asset purchases to its function as the lender of last resort, the institution that provides emergency liquidity to financial institutions and markets when private sources of liquidity have dried up. The principle of lender of last resort intervention was articulated by Walter Bagehot in his 1873 work Lombard Street, where he argued that in a financial crisis, the central bank should lend freely to solvent institutions at a penalty rate against good collateral. Bagehot's dictum was designed to address liquidity crises, situations in which fundamentally solvent institutions face a temporary inability to meet their short-term obligations because of a panic-driven withdrawal of funding, while avoiding the subsidization of insolvent institutions that should be allowed to fail. In practice, the distinction between liquidity and solvency is far more difficult to draw in real time than Bagehot's framework suggests, and the Fed's emergency interventions have consistently crossed the line from liquidity provision to outright subsidization. The 2008 financial crisis provides the most dramatic illustration of this crossing. In the span of approximately 18 months, the Fed created a series of emergency lending facilities with an alphabet soup of acronyms: the TAF, Term Auction Facility; the PDCF, Primary Dealer Credit Facility; the TSLF, Term Securities Lending Facility; the CPFF, Commercial Paper Funding Facility; the MMIFF, Money Market Investor Funding Facility; the TALF, Term Asset-Backed Securities Loan Facility, and others that collectively provided trillions of dollars in emergency liquidity to financial institutions, money market funds, the commercial paper market, and the asset-backed securities market. It engineered the emergency acquisition of Bear Stearns by J.P. Morgan Chase in March 2008, providing $29 billion in financing to absorb Bear Stearns' most toxic assets. It extended an $85 billion emergency credit line to AIG, the insurance conglomerate whose derivatives portfolio, specifically its massive book of credit default swaps on mortgage-backed securities, threatened to trigger a cascading series of counterparty defaults that could have collapsed the global financial system. It provided emergency lending to Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley after they hastily converted from investment banks to bank holding companies to gain access to the Fed's discount window, a conversion that was approved by the Fed in a matter of days, compared to the months or years that such applications would normally require. The total volume of emergency lending during the 2008 crisis peaked at approximately $1.7 trillion outstanding at any given time, with cumulative lending over the entire crisis period substantially higher. These interventions were subsidies in the most direct possible sense. They provided capital to institutions at below market rates during a period when those institutions could not access private capital at any rate. The Fed lent at the discount rate, which during the crisis was lowered to 0.5%. Far below any rate available in the private market, where many of these institutions would have faced rates of 10, 15, or 20% had any private lender been willing to lend to them at all, which in many cases no private lender was. The Fed accepted as collateral securities that no private lender would touch, including mortgage-backed securities of uncertain value, structured credit products of extraordinary complexity, and equity stakes in companies whose solvency was in question. It extended the terms of its lending far beyond the overnight or very short-term windows that characterized normal Fed operations, providing term lending of 28 days, 84 days, and in some cases even longer. And it did all of this without requiring the kinds of conditions, equity dilution, management changes, restrictions on executive compensation, restructuring plans, that a private lender would demand from a borrower in such desperate straits. The Fed was, in effect, providing unconditional below-market financing to the largest and most politically powerful financial institutions in the world at the precise moment when those institutions' own reckless behavior, their over-leveraged balance sheets, their massive concentrations of subprime mortgage exposure, their reliance on short-term wholesale funding markets that evaporated in a panic, had brought them to the brink of insolvency. The defenders of these interventions argue that the Fed eventually recovered all of its emergency loans and earned a profit on the transactions, a fact that is true and that is routinely cited as evidence that the interventions were not true subsidies. But this argument confuses ex post outcomes with ex ante subsidization. At the time the loans were made, the risk of loss was substantial and uncertain. The below market rates constituted a subsidy, regardless of whether the loans were eventually repaid, just as a below market mortgage from a government program constitutes a subsidy, even if the borrower makes all payments on time. If a private lender had offered identical terms, the same rates, the same collateral standards, the same duration to these institutions during the crisis, it would have been providing subsidized financing. The fact that the lender was the Fed rather than a private institution does not change the economics. It merely changes the politics. Moreover, the ultimate recovery of the loans was itself partly a product of the Fed's other interventions: the zero interest rate policy, the quantitative easing, the forward guidance, which reflated asset prices and thereby restored the solvency of institutions that might otherwise have failed. The Fed's emergency lending was repaid in part because the Fed's other policies engineered the very conditions under which repayment became possible. The circularity of this logic, the Fed subsidized the banks, then the Fed's other subsidies made the first subsidies look profitable, is a feature of the system, not a refutation of the subsidy claim. The 2020 pandemic response expanded the Fed's subsidization function even further, crossing boundaries that had previously been considered inviolable. In addition to restarting quantitative easing at an unprecedented pace, the Fed created the Main Street Lending Program, which provided financing to medium-sized businesses that were too large for the Small Business Administration's Paycheck Protection Program, but too small to access the corporate bond market. It created the Municipal Liquidity Facility, which purchased short-term debt directly from state and local governments that were facing severe revenue shortfalls due to pandemic-related economic contraction. It created the primary market corporate credit facility and the secondary market corporate credit facility, which purchased corporate bonds and corporate bond ETFs, exchange-traded funds, holding diversified portfolios of corporate debt directly in the primary and secondary markets. For the first time in its 107-year history, the Federal Reserve was purchasing the debt of private corporations, companies like Apple, Microsoft, AT&T, Verizon, Toyota Motor Credit, and Berkshire Hathaway, using money it created from nothing. It was also purchasing shares of ETFs managed by BlackRock, the world's largest asset manager, which the Fed had hired as its agent to implement the corporate credit facilities. The potential conflicts of interest in this arrangement, BlackRock advising the Fed on which securities to buy while managing funds that held those same securities, were noted by critics, but did not prevent the programs from proceeding. These interventions crossed a line that had previously been considered inviolable in American central banking, the line between monetary policy, which manages the aggregate money supply and interest rates, and credit allocation policy, which directs resources to specific sectors, industries, or companies. When the Fed buys Treasury securities, it is conducting monetary policy, affecting the overall level of interest rates without directing credit to any specific entity. When the Fed buys corporate bonds, it is making credit allocation decisions, deciding that AT&T deserves cheap credit, that Toyota Motor Credit deserves cheap credit, that Berkshire Hathaway deserves cheap credit, decisions that have traditionally been the province of private markets and, when government involvement is warranted, of Congress and the executive branch through legislatively authorized programs. The Fed's corporate bond purchases were technically authorized by Section 13(3) of the Federal Reserve Act, which allows emergency lending to non-bank entities in unusual and exigent circumstances with the approval of the Treasury Secretary. But the breadth and generality of the 2020 programs, which were not targeted at specific failing institutions but at entire asset classes, stretched the statutory authority beyond anything its authors contemplated and raised fundamental questions about democratic accountability. When an unelected, largely independent institution creates trillions of dollars and uses that money to purchase the debt of specific corporations, it is exercising a power that is functionally equivalent to fiscal policy, the power to tax and spend, without the democratic legitimacy that fiscal policy derives from congressional authorization. The moral hazard implications of the Fed's increasingly expansive lender of last resort function are well understood by economists and central bankers, but are chronically underappreciated in public discourse and media coverage. Moral hazard refers to the phenomenon in which the expectation of being rescued from the consequences of risky behavior encourages more of that risky behavior. When financial institutions know, or believe with high confidence, that the Fed will intervene to prevent their failure, they have a rational incentive to take on more risk than they otherwise would, because they capture the upside of risky bets, the profits from leveraged positions, from concentrated exposures, from maturity mismatch, from complex and opaque derivatives, while the downside is effectively socialized through Fed intervention. This is the too big to fail problem, and it is fundamentally a subsidy problem, not merely a regulatory problem. The implicit guarantee that the Fed will rescue systemically important financial institutions constitutes a subsidy to those institutions, a subsidy that is reflected in measurable economic phenomena, their lower borrowing costs relative to smaller competitors, because creditors know they will be made whole in a crisis, their higher leverage ratios, because they can take on more debt without fearing the kind of sudden creditor flight that would destroy a smaller institution, their greater risk appetite, because they can pursue higher return, higher risk strategies, knowing that the worst-case scenario, outright failure, has been effectively truncated by the Fed's backstop. Research by the International Monetary Fund, published in their global financial stability reports, has estimated that the implicit too-big-to-fail subsidy to the largest global banks was worth approximately $70 billion per year in the period leading up to the 2008 crisis, and that the subsidy increased substantially in the immediate aftermath of the crisis, as the scope of government backstops expanded. The Government Accountability Office produced estimates in a similar range. This is a subsidy that flows directly from the American public, which bears the residual risk of Fed losses, and which suffers the economic consequences of the financial instability that moral hazard engenders, to the shareholders, executives, and creditors of the largest financial institutions in the world. The Fed's influence extends even further through the mechanism of forward guidance, the practice, formalized as a deliberate policy tool during the Bernanke era and refined under his successors, Janet Yellen and Jerome Powell, of communicating the likely future path of monetary policy to financial markets. Before the Bernanke era, the Fed's communication was deliberately opaque. Former Chair Alan Greenspan was famous for his incomprehensible public statements, once telling a congressional committee that if they thought they understood what he had said, he must have misspoken. This opacity was considered a feature, not a bug, because it preserved the Fed's flexibility to change course without the market disruption that broken promises would create. Bernanke reversed this approach, arguing that transparency about the Fed's intentions would itself be a policy tool, that by telling markets what the Fed planned to do, the Fed could affect financial conditions immediately without waiting for actual policy changes to take effect. When the FOMC issues a statement saying that it anticipates that an accommodative stance of monetary policy will remain appropriate for a considerable time, or that it expects to maintain the target range for the federal funds rate at its current level until labor market conditions have reached levels consistent with maximum employment and inflation has risen to 2% and is on track to moderately exceed 2% for some time, it is not merely describing its intentions, it is shaping market expectations in ways that affect asset prices, borrowing costs, and investment decisions immediately and powerfully. Forward guidance that signals continued low rates encourages investors to take on more risk because the expected cost of leveraged positions remains low for a longer horizon. It encourages corporations to issue more debt because the expected cost of servicing that debt remains low. It encourages homebuyers to bid more aggressively for houses because the expected cost of mortgage financing remains low. And it depresses the returns available to savers, retirees living on fixed incomes, pension funds trying to meet their obligations, conservative investors seeking capital preservation because the Fed has effectively promised to keep the return on safe assets at zero for the foreseeable future. Forward guidance is, in this sense, a subsidy delivery mechanism that uses words rather than money to transfer wealth from savers to borrowers and from conservative investors to risk takers. The cumulative effect of these mechanisms, interest rate suppression, quantitative easing, emergency lending, forward guidance, implicit guarantees, is a system in which the Federal Reserve functions as the supreme subsidizer of the American economy. It subsidizes the banking system by providing below-market funding. It subsidizes the housing market by purchasing mortgage-backed securities and driving down mortgage rates. It subsidizes the corporate sector by purchasing corporate bonds and suppressing the cost of corporate borrowing. It subsidizes the federal government by purchasing treasury securities and driving down the cost of deficit financing. It subsidizes asset owners by inflating the value of stocks, bonds, and real estate. It subsidizes risk takers by truncating the downside of financial risk through implicit guarantees and explicit emergency lending. And it does all of this through mechanisms that are technically complex, institutionally opaque, and effectively invisible to the vast majority of citizens who experience the Fed's actions not as subsidies but as the natural movements of market forces. The Federal Reserve is the supreme subsidizer not because it intends to redistribute wealth upward. The stated intentions of Fed officials are entirely sincere in their focus on employment and price stability, but because the structure of monetary policy in a highly financialized economy makes every interest rate decision, every asset purchase, and every emergency intervention a decision about who gets subsidized and who does not. And in a system where wealth is concentrated and financial assets are owned disproportionately by the affluent, the default distributional consequence of expansionary monetary policy is upward redistribution. The Fed does not need to intend this outcome for it to occur. The architecture of the financial system produces it automatically, as reliably as gravity pulls objects downward. Understanding this architecture, understanding the Fed not as a neutral technocratic institution, but as the most powerful subsidization mechanism in the American state, is essential to understanding everything that follows in this analysis, from the tax code to the insurance system to the venture capital ecosystem to the gig economy and beyond. The Internal Revenue Code of the United States is the single most consequential document in the construction and maintenance of the American middle class, and it is also the single most consequential document in the perpetuation of American economic inequality. These two facts are not contradictions. They are complementary features of a system that uses the tax code as the primary delivery mechanism for government subsidies to individuals, families, and corporations, a delivery mechanism that is psychologically invisible, politically protected, and distributionally regressive in ways that would be immediately recognizable as unjust if the same resources were allocated through direct government spending programs subject to ordinary democratic scrutiny. The tax code is not, as it is popularly understood, merely a mechanism for raising revenue to fund government operations. It is a vast, intricate, and continuously evolving machine for allocating resources, shaping behavior, rewarding certain forms of economic activity, penalizing others, and distributing benefits to specific populations through a mechanism, tax reduction, that is psychologically and politically distinct from direct government spending. This distinction is not substantive in any economic sense. A dollar not collected in taxes has the identical fiscal impact as a dollar spent in direct outlays. Both reduce the government's net fiscal position by $1. Both transfer resources from the government to a private actor. Both must ultimately be financed through borrowing or through higher taxes on someone else. But the distinction is politically and psychologically decisive, because it determines whether the beneficiary perceives themselves as a recipient of government largesse, a status that carries stigma in American political culture, or as a self-sufficient taxpayer who is simply keeping more of their own money, a status that carries honor and legitimacy. The tax code exploits this perceptual asymmetry with extraordinary sophistication, delivering hundreds of billions of dollars in government subsidies to tens of millions of Americans who are convinced, sincerely and with great emotional investment, that they have never received a government benefit in their lives. The tax code is the engine of the submerged state, and understanding its subsidy function in granular technical detail is essential to understanding the hidden architecture of American economic life and the political dynamics that make that architecture so resistant to reform. The concept of tax expenditures, a term coined by Stanley Surrey, the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Tax Policy under Presidents Kennedy and Johnson, refers to revenue losses attributable to provisions of the tax code that provide special or preferential treatment for certain types of income, certain types of expenditures, or certain categories of taxpayers. Surrey's insight, first articulated systematically in his 1973 book, Pathways to Tax Reform, and developed further in his 1985 work, Tax Expenditures, co-authored with Paul McDaniel, was that these provisions are functionally identical to direct government spending programs. A tax deduction for mortgage interest is economically equivalent to a government check sent to homeowners to subsidize their housing costs. A tax exclusion for employer-sponsored health insurance is economically equivalent to the government purchasing health insurance for employees and delivering it through their employers. A tax credit for research and development is economically equivalent to a government grant to corporations to subsidize their innovation activities. The only difference between these tax provisions and their direct spending equivalents is the delivery mechanism, and that difference, Surrey argued with remarkable prescience, was being systematically exploited to shield these subsidies from the transparency, accountability, and distributional scrutiny that would be applied to direct spending programs of equivalent magnitude. Tax expenditures do not appear in the federal budget as spending items. They are not subject to annual appropriations votes on the floor of Congress. They do not require periodic reauthorization through the committee process. They are not administered by government agencies, subject to oversight hearings, inspector general audits, or government accountability office reviews. They are not means-tested. They do not phase out as income increases, and in many cases they actually increase in value as income increases. They are, in Surrey's incisive phrase, backdoor spending. Spending that has been laundered through the tax code to make it politically invisible and democratically unaccountable. Surrey's framework was adopted by the Congressional Budget Act of 1974, which required the executive branch to publish an annual tax expenditure budget alongside the regular budget, a requirement that has been fulfilled every year since, producing a document that catalogs hundreds of individual tax expenditures and estimates their revenue cost. And yet, despite nearly 50 years of official acknowledgement that tax expenditures are functionally equivalent to government spending, the political discourse continues to treat them as fundamentally different, as tax relief rather than government benefits, as keeping your own money rather than receiving a transfer, as the absence of government rather than the presence of government operating through a different channel. The scale of the tax expenditure system is enormous, growing, and in many ways more consequential than the direct spending programs that dominate public attention and political debate. The Joint Committee on Taxation, the nonpartisan congressional body responsible for estimating the revenue impact of tax legislation, publishes an annual report on tax expenditures that runs to hundreds of pages and catalogs more than 250 individual provisions covering virtually every domain of economic life: housing, healthcare, retirement, education, energy, agriculture, manufacturing, financial services, charitable giving, state and local governance, international commerce, and dozens of other areas. The total revenue loss from these provisions has been estimated at approximately $1.5 to $1.9 trillion per year in recent fiscal years, depending on the methodology used, the baseline against which the expenditures are measured, and the interaction effects between provisions that make simple aggregation problematic. To appreciate the sheer magnitude of this number, consider the following comparisons. Total federal revenue from individual income taxes, the largest single source of federal revenue, is approximately $2.6 trillion per year. The government forgoes in tax expenditures an amount equal to more than half of what it actually collects in income taxes. Stated differently, if all tax expenditures were eliminated and the resulting revenue were used to reduce tax rates, the average income tax rate could be reduced by more than 1/3. Alternatively, total discretionary federal spending, the budget category that includes national defense, education, transportation, scientific research, environmental protection, veteran services, the judiciary, foreign aid, and all other non-entitlement programs, is approximately $1.7 trillion per year. The government spends more through the tax code than it spends through its entire discretionary budget. The tax expenditure budget exceeds the combined spending on Social Security, which is approximately $1.3 trillion, Medicare, which is approximately $900 billion, and Medicaid, which is approximately $600 billion. The submerged state is not a marginal feature of American fiscal policy. It is a dominant feature, arguably the single dominant feature, of the American welfare state, dwarfing the visible programs that consume the vast majority of public attention, media coverage, and political controversy. The largest individual tax expenditure is the exclusion of employer-sponsored health insurance premiums from taxable income, a provision that illustrates, with exceptional clarity, how the submerged state operates, how it was created, and why it persists, despite being widely recognized as inequitable and inefficient. The origin of this exclusion is a story of wartime improvisation that became permanent policy through institutional path dependence and interest group politics. During World War II, the federal government imposed wage and price controls to prevent inflation in an economy operating at full capacity for military production. These controls prevented employers from competing for scarce workers by offering higher wages. Employers responded by offering non-wage benefits, particularly health insurance, as a way to attract and retain workers without violating the wage controls. In 1943, the Internal Revenue Service issued an administrative ruling declaring that employer contributions to employee health insurance plans were not taxable income to the employee. This ruling was not the product of deliberate policy design. It was an ad hoc administrative decision made by a mid-level IRS official in the context of wartime economic management, but it set in motion a chain of institutional developments that would reshape the American healthcare system and create the largest single tax expenditure in the federal budget. After the war ended and wage controls were lifted, the exclusion remained in place, not because anyone made a deliberate policy decision to preserve it, but because no one made a deliberate policy decision to eliminate it. The Revenue Act of 1954, the most comprehensive revision of the tax code since the original 1913 Act, formally codified the exclusion in statute, giving it the permanence and legitimacy of congressional enactment. The exclusion created a powerful incentive for employers to provide health insurance as part of employee compensation packages because the employer could deduct the cost as a business expense while the employee received the benefit tax-free, a double tax advantage that made employer-sponsored insurance dramatically cheaper than individually purchased insurance. This tax advantage channeled the development of the American healthcare system through the employer-based model, creating an entire industry, the employer-sponsored group insurance industry, that is a direct artifact of a tax provision created by accident during a world war. For an employee in the 22% marginal federal income tax bracket receiving $20,000 per year in employer-sponsored health insurance, a figure that approximates the average employer contribution for family coverage and employer-sponsored plans, this exclusion saves approximately $4,400 in federal income taxes alone. Adding the exclusion from the employee's share of FICA payroll taxes, which are levied at 7.65% on wages up to the Social Security wage base and at 1.45% on wages above that base, increases the tax savings to approximately $5,930 per year. For a family in the 32% bracket, corresponding to taxable income of approximately $190,000 to $364,000 for married couples, the same $20,000 insurance package generates federal income tax savings of approximately $6,400 plus payroll tax savings for a total approaching $8,000 per year. For a family in the 37% bracket, the highest ordinary income tax rate, applying to taxable income above approximately $693,000, the savings exceed $9,000 per year. Meanwhile, a minimum wage worker in the 10% bracket who is fortunate enough to receive employer-sponsored insurance, and many are not, since low-wage employers are far less likely to offer health benefits, saves approximately $2,000 per year on a $10,000 insurance package. The subsidy is not only regressive in its rate structure, providing larger percentage savings to higher income workers, but also regressive in its coverage, since higher income workers are far more likely to work for employers that offer health insurance and far more likely to receive more generous insurance packages. The total revenue cost of this single exclusion is estimated at approximately $300 to $350 billion per year in foregone federal income and payroll tax revenue, making it the single largest subsidy in the entire American fiscal system, larger than the entire budget of the Department of Veterans Affairs, larger than the entire budget of the Department of Education, larger than the entire budget of the Department of Homeland Security, larger than the combined budgets of the Departments of State, Justice, Commerce, Interior, and Labor. It is a subsidy of staggering magnitude, and it is almost entirely invisible to its beneficiaries, who experience their employer-sponsored health insurance as a benefit provided by their employer, a form of private sector compensation, rather than as a government subsidy financed by the taxes of others. The second largest category of tax expenditures involves the preferential treatment of income from capital, capital gains, qualified dividends, and the various provisions that allow capital income to be deferred, excluded, or taxed at rates far below those applied to wage income. Under current law, as established by the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 and modified by subsequent legislation, long-term capital gains, profits realized from the sale of assets held for more than 1 year, are taxed at rates of 0, 15, or 20%, depending on the taxpayer's total taxable income, compared to ordinary income tax rates that range from 10 to 37%. Qualified dividends, dividends paid by domestic corporations and certain foreign corporations that meet holding period requirements, are taxed at the same preferential rates. The revenue cost of these preferential rates has been estimated at approximately $130 to $180 billion per year, though this figure is sensitive to market conditions, because capital gains realizations increase when asset prices are rising and decrease when they are falling. The distributional profile of the capital gains preference is even more extreme than that of the health insurance exclusion. Approximately 75% of the benefit flows to the top 1% of income earners, and approximately 95% flows to the top quintile. The bottom 60% of the income distribution receives virtually no benefit because they own virtually no capital assets that generate taxable capital gains. This is not merely a matter of the bottom 60% choosing not to invest. It is a structural feature of an economy in which the ownership of capital is concentrated to an extraordinary degree. Federal Reserve data indicate that the top 1% of households by wealth own approximately 54% of all corporate equities and mutual fund shares, while the bottom 50% own approximately 1%. The capital gains preference is a subsidy to the owners of capital, and therefore, overwhelmingly, a subsidy to the already wealthy. The preferential treatment of capital gains income has a long and politically contentious history that illuminates how subsidy provisions are created, justified, defended, and perpetuated through the interaction of economic theory, political ideology, and interest group lobbying. The original federal income tax, established by the Revenue Act of 1913 following the ratification of the 16th Amendment, did not distinguish between ordinary income and capital gains. All income, regardless of its source, was taxed at the same graduated rates. The first capital gains preference was introduced in the Revenue Act of 1921, which allowed taxpayers to pay a maximum rate of 12.5% on gains from the sale of assets held for more than 2 years, regardless of their marginal tax rate on ordinary income. The stated justification was the lock-in effect, the argument that taxing capital gains at ordinary rates would discourage investors from selling appreciated assets, thereby reducing the liquidity and allocative efficiency of capital markets. This argument, which has been the primary intellectual justification for preferential capital gains treatment for more than a century, contains a kernel of truth. Higher capital gains tax rates do, all else equal, reduce the realization of gains because taxpayers have the option of simply holding their assets and deferring the tax indefinitely. But the lock-in argument is also profoundly incomplete and strategically misleading because it frames the capital gains preference exclusively as an efficiency measure, a correction for market distortion, while ignoring its distributional consequences and its role as a subsidy for wealth accumulation. The lock-in effect is a real phenomenon, but it is a phenomenon that affects primarily the very wealthy, because they are the ones who hold the vast majority of appreciated assets. Reducing the capital gains rate to unlock their holdings is equivalent to giving them a tax cut to incentivize them to do something, sell assets and redeploy capital that benefits primarily themselves. The efficiency gains from reducing lock-in are modest and contested in the empirical literature. The distributional consequences, a massive reduction in the effective tax rate on the highest income Americans, are enormous and unambiguous. The power of the capital gains preference as a wealth concentration mechanism is dramatically amplified by its interaction with two other provisions of the tax code that, taken together, create what tax scholars have called the buy, borrow, die strategy, a strategy that allows the wealthiest Americans to accumulate enormous fortunes, enjoy the economic benefits of those fortunes during their lifetimes, and pass them to their heirs with little or no capital gains tax ever being paid. The first provision is the deferral of capital gains on unsold assets. Under the realization principle that has governed American income taxation since its inception, capital gains are not taxed until the asset is sold, that is, until the gain is realized. An investor who buys a stock for $1 million and watches it appreciate to $100 million over the course of decades owes no capital gains tax whatsoever as long as they do not sell the stock. The unrealized gain of $99 million is economically real. The investor is $99 million wealthier, can borrow against the appreciated stock at favorable rates, and can use the stock as collateral for virtually unlimited consumption, but it is fiscally invisible. No tax is owed. No tax return reports the gain. The gain simply accumulates, year after year, compounding tax-free, while the investor enjoys the economic benefits of the wealth. This deferral is itself a subsidy. The time value of money means that a tax deferred is a tax reduced, and for very long holding periods, the reduction can be substantial. An investor who defers a 20% capital gains tax for 30 years and earns a 7% annual return on the deferred tax payment effectively reduces their tax burden by approximately half compared to an investor who realizes and pays the tax immediately. The second provision is the step-up in basis at death. Under Section 1014 of the Internal Revenue Code, when a person dies, the cost basis of their assets, the price at which the assets are deemed to have been acquired for purposes of calculating capital gains, is stepped up to the fair market value at the date of death. This means that all capital gains accumulated during the decedent's lifetime, gains that were never taxed because the assets were never sold, are permanently erased for tax purposes. The heirs inherit the assets at the new, stepped-up basis and can sell them immediately without paying any capital gains tax on the appreciation that occurred during the decedent's lifetime. Consider the investor described above, who purchased stock for $1 million and watched it appreciate to $100 million. If that investor dies without selling the stock, the $99 million in capital gains is never taxed. Not during the investor's lifetime, because the stock was never sold, and not at the investor's death, because the basis is stepped up to $100 million. The heirs inherit the stock at a basis of $100 million. If they sell it the next day for $100 million, they owe zero capital gains tax. $99 million in appreciation, an entire lifetime of capital accumulation, passes through the tax system without generating a single dollar of capital gains tax revenue. The Joint Committee on Taxation has estimated the annual revenue cost of the step-up in basis at approximately $45 to $55 billion per year. Combined with the deferral of unrealized gains and the preferential rate on gains that are actually realized, these provisions create a system that is custom designed, whether intentionally or through the accumulated logic of legislative incrementalism, for the perpetuation and acceleration of dynastic wealth. The buy, borrow, die strategy is not a loophole exploited by a few clever tax lawyers. It is the fundamental architecture of how capital income is treated in the American tax system, and it is available only to those who have enough capital to make the strategy worth pursuing, that is, the already wealthy. The mortgage interest deduction, introduced briefly in Section 1, deserves substantially more detailed treatment here as a case study in how tax expenditures function as invisible subsidies with perverse distributional consequences and extraordinary political durability. The deduction allows taxpayers who itemize their deductions to subtract the interest paid on mortgage debt up to $750,000, reduced from the previous limit of $1 million by the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 from their taxable income. For a taxpayer in the 24% marginal tax bracket who pays $15,000 in mortgage interest annually, the deduction saves $3,600 in federal income taxes. For a taxpayer in the 37% bracket paying $25,000 in mortgage interest, the savings are $9,250. For a taxpayer in the 12% bracket paying $6,000 in mortgage interest, if they even have enough total itemized deductions to exceed the standard deduction, which since 2018 has been $27,700 for married couples, the savings would be $720. The deduction is thus worth more than 12 times as much to the high-income taxpayer as to the low-income taxpayer. And for the millions of homeowners whose total itemized deductions do not exceed the standard deduction, a group that expanded dramatically after the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act nearly doubled the standard deduction, the mortgage interest deduction is worth exactly nothing. Research estimates that following the 2017 tax reform, only approximately 10 to 12% of tax filers itemize their deductions, meaning that roughly 88 to 90% of all taxpayers, including millions of homeowners, receive no benefit whatsoever from the mortgage interest deduction. The subsidy is concentrated not merely among homeowners, but among the wealthiest homeowners, those with the largest mortgages, the highest marginal tax rates, and sufficient other deductions to make itemizing worthwhile. The economic evidence on whether the mortgage interest deduction actually increases homeownership, its ostensible policy purpose, is remarkably consistent and remarkably damning. Virtually every rigorous empirical study of the deduction has concluded that it has little or no effect on the homeownership rate. A landmark 2017 study published in the American Economic Review by economists Andrew Hansen, Hal Martin, and Bo Zhao used variation in state income tax rates to identify the causal effect of the mortgage interest deduction on homeownership and found no statistically significant effect. International comparisons tell the same story. Countries that have no mortgage interest deduction, including Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, and Germany, have homeownership rates that are comparable to or higher than the United States. The reason the deduction fails to increase homeownership is straightforward. The deduction subsidizes the size of the mortgage, not the decision to buy. It encourages homeowners who would have bought a home anyway to buy a larger, more expensive home with a larger mortgage, capitalizing the subsidy into higher home prices rather than expanding access to homeownership. The net effect is a transfer of wealth from renters and taxpayers generally to affluent homeowners specifically, mediated through higher home prices that make home ownership less affordable for first-time buyers. The mortgage interest deduction is, in the assessment of most housing economists, the single worst designed housing subsidy in the federal budget, a provision that costs approximately $25 to $30 billion per year, fails to achieve its stated policy objective, exacerbates housing affordability problems, and distributes its benefits overwhelmingly to the affluent. And yet the mortgage interest deduction is politically sacrosanct, a third rail of tax policy that no serious politician dares to touch. It has survived every major tax reform effort since 1986, when the Tax Reform Act eliminated the deduction for consumer interest on credit cards, auto loans, and personal loans, but preserved the mortgage interest deduction intact, a decision that reflected the overwhelming political power of the real estate lobby, rather than any principled distinction between mortgage interest and other forms of personal interest. The political economy of the deduction's survival is instructive for understanding how tax expenditures persist long after their policy rationale has been discredited. The deduction creates and sustains a coalition of interest groups: the National Association of Realtors, the National Association of Home Builders, the Mortgage Bankers Association, the American Bankers Association, and virtually every organization representing the real estate and housing finance industries that will mobilize ferociously to oppose any attempt to reduce or eliminate the deduction. The National Association of Realtors alone reported spending over $84 million on lobbying and political contributions in a recent election cycle, making it one of the 5 largest lobbying organizations in Washington. These organizations deploy sophisticated public relations campaigns that frame the mortgage interest deduction as essential to the American dream of homeownership, a framing that is empirically false but emotionally powerful, and that characterize any proposed reform as an attack on middle-class homeowners, even though the vast majority of middle-class homeowners receive little or no benefit from the deduction. The deduction also benefits from the psychological dynamics of the submerged state described in Section 1, because homeowners experience the deduction as a reduction in their tax bill rather than as a government payment. They do not perceive it as a benefit that could be taken away, but as a natural feature of the tax system that they have earned by purchasing a home and paying their mortgage. The deduction has been capitalized into home prices, meaning that home prices are higher than they would be in the absence of the deduction, which means that eliminating the deduction would reduce home values, generating opposition from every existing homeowner whose net worth would decline. The deduction thus creates its own constituency for preservation, regardless of its merits as policy. The tax code's subsidy function extends far beyond individual tax expenditures to encompass the entire structure of business taxation, which constitutes a parallel system of subsidies, preferences, and incentives that is at least as complex and at least as consequential as the individual tax expenditure system. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 reduced the statutory corporate income tax rate from 35% to 21%, a reduction of 14 percentage points, or 40%, that was projected by the Joint Committee on Taxation to reduce federal revenue by approximately $1.35 trillion over the 10-year budget window. This rate reduction was the single largest component of the most expensive tax legislation in a generation, and it was marketed to the American public as a pro-growth measure that would unleash business investment, raise worker wages, and make American companies more competitive in the global economy. The Trump administration's Council of Economic Advisors published a report claiming that the corporate rate cut would increase average household income by $4,000 to $9,000 per year, a projection that was dismissed by virtually every mainstream economist as wildly implausible, and that was, in fact, not borne out by subsequent economic data. The actual distributional analysis, conducted by the Joint Committee on Taxation and the Tax Policy Center using standard incidence assumptions, tells a very different story. Approximately 35% of the benefit of the corporate rate cut flows directly to the owners of corporate equity, shareholders, in the form of higher after-tax corporate earnings and higher stock prices. The top 1% of income earners, who own approximately 54% of all corporate stock, therefore receive approximately 19% of the total benefit of the corporate rate cut. The top 20%, who own approximately 89% of all corporate stock, receive approximately 31% of the direct shareholder benefit. The remaining 65% of the benefit is allocated through various channels, some to workers through potentially higher wages, some to consumers through potentially lower prices, some to managers and executives through higher compensation. But even under the most worker-friendly incidence assumptions, the distributional profile remains sharply tilted toward the top of the income distribution. The JCT estimated that the corporate tax provisions of the TCJA provided approximately $320 billion in benefits to the top 1% over the 10-year budget window, compared to approximately $18 billion for the bottom 60%. A tax cut that costs the Treasury $1.35 trillion and delivers 24 times more benefit to the richest 1% than to the bottom 60%, is, by any objective standard, a subsidy to the wealthy masquerading as economic stimulus. But the statutory rate is only the beginning of the corporate tax subsidy system. The tax code provides a labyrinth of additional corporate subsidies that collectively reduce the effective tax rate paid by corporations far below the statutory rate, and that direct the benefits of reduced taxation to specific industries, activities, and asset classes based on the lobbying power of the affected interests, rather than on any coherent economic rationale. Accelerated depreciation allows corporations to deduct the cost of capital investments, buildings, machinery, equipment, vehicles, software, faster than those investments actually lose economic value through wear and obsolescence. Under the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act's full expensing provision, which was in effect from 2017 through 2022, corporations could deduct the full cost of qualifying investments in the year the investment was made, a 100% first-year deduction that effectively eliminated the corporate income tax on the return to new investment. This provision was worth approximately $30 to $40 billion per year in reduced corporate tax revenue and was heavily concentrated among capital-intensive industries, manufacturing, energy, telecommunications, and transportation, whose investments qualified for the deduction. The economic logic of accelerated depreciation is that it reduces the after-tax cost of investment, thereby encouraging more investment and faster economic growth. The distributional logic is that it subsidizes industries that make large capital expenditures at the expense of industries that rely primarily on labor, service industries, retail, hospitality, and that it benefits the owners and shareholders of capital-intensive companies at the expense of the general tax base. The Research and Development Tax Credit, codified in Section 41 of the Internal Revenue Code and made permanent by the Protecting Americans from Tax Hikes Act of 2015, after decades of temporary extensions, provides a tax credit equal to approximately 20% of qualified research expenditures above a base amount. The credit is worth approximately $15 to $20 billion per year in reduced corporate tax revenue and is heavily concentrated among a relatively small number of large corporations in technology, pharmaceuticals, aerospace, and automotive industries. The top 20 recipients of the R&D credit account for a substantial share of total credit claims. The policy rationale for the R&D credit is strong. Basic economic theory indicates that private markets underinvest in research and development because the social returns to innovation exceed the private returns, creating a positive externality that justifies government subsidy. But the design of the credit, which rewards incremental spending above a base amount rather than targeting spending on basic research with the highest spillover potential, means that much of the subsidized R&D spending would have occurred anyway, and that the credit functions in part as a windfall to companies that are already investing heavily in research. The carried interest provision deserves extended treatment because it exemplifies how the tax code subsidizes the private equity and venture capital industries that function as the command and control centers of American capital deployment, and that will be analyzed in detail in subsequent sections of this work. Carried interest is the term for the share of investment profits, typically 20%, that is paid to the general partners of private equity funds, hedge funds, venture capital funds, and real estate investment partnerships as their compensation for managing the fund and generating returns for the fund's investors, known as limited partners. The general partners typically invest a relatively small amount of their own capital in the fund, usually 1 to 2% of the total fund size, but receive 20% of the fund's profits. This compensation structure, known as the 2 and 20 model, means that for every $100 of profit generated by the fund, $20 goes to the general partner and $80 goes to the limited partners who provided the vast majority of the capital. Under current tax law, the general partner's 20% profit share, the carried interest, is taxed at the preferential long-term capital gains rate of 20% rather than at the ordinary income tax rate of 37% that would apply if the same income were classified as compensation for services. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act added a 3-year holding period requirement for carried interest to qualify for long-term capital gains treatment, but this requirement had minimal practical impact because most private equity investments are held for longer than 3 years anyway. The classification of carried interest as capital gains rather than ordinary income is, from an economic standpoint, indefensible. The general partner's carried interest is not a return on their own invested capital. Their 1 to 2% capital contribution generates a return proportional to its size, and that proportional return is legitimately taxable as capital gains. The carried interest, the additional 20% of profits received in excess of the general partner's proportional share, is compensation for the service of managing the fund. It is economically equivalent to a performance bonus paid to an employee who generates profits for their employer. If a hedge fund manager earned the same income as a salaried employee of a financial institution, it would be taxed at ordinary income rates of up to 37%. The carried interest loophole allows the identical economic income to be taxed at 20%, a rate reduction of nearly half, solely because of the legal structure through which it is received. The revenue cost has been estimated at approximately $14 to $18 billion over a 10-year period, which understates the economic significance because the beneficiaries are an extraordinarily small and extraordinarily wealthy group. The top private equity fund managers, individuals at firms like Blackstone, KKR, Apollo, Carlyle, and TPG, earn hundreds of millions of dollars per year in carried interest, and in some cases billions of dollars in a single year from a particularly successful fund. These individuals pay an effective federal income tax rate of approximately 23 to 25% on their total income, lower than the effective rate paid by many professionals earning a fraction of their income. The persistence of the carried interest loophole, despite broad bipartisan agreement that it is unjustified, both Barack Obama and Donald Trump campaigned on closing it, is a testament to the political power of the private equity industry, which has deployed enormous resources to protect the provision through campaign contributions, lobbying, and the strategic cultivation of relationships with key members of the congressional tax writing committees. The tax code also functions as a massive subsidy engine for retirement savings through the tax advantage treatment of contributions to and accumulations within qualified retirement accounts. The architecture of retirement savings subsidies is complex, involving multiple account types with different contribution limits, eligibility requirements, and tax treatment. Traditional 401k plans and 403b plans for nonprofit employees, which allow pre-tax contributions of up to $23,000 per year, with an additional catch-up contribution of $7,500 for employees over 50. Traditional individual retirement accounts, which allow pre-tax contributions of up to $7,000 per year, with a catch-up contribution of $1,000. Roth versions of both 401k plans and IRAs, which accept after-tax contributions but allow tax-free growth and tax-free withdrawals in retirement. Simplified employee pension plans for self-employed individuals and small business owners, which allow contributions of up to 25% of net self-employment income, or $69,000, whichever is less. And defined benefit pension plans, which allow employers to deduct contributions sufficient to fund promised future benefits, with no explicit dollar limit on annual contributions. The combined revenue cost of these provisions, the tax revenue foregone because of the preferential treatment of retirement savings, is estimated at approximately $250 to $300 billion per year, making retirement savings tax preferences the second largest category of individual tax expenditures after the employer health insurance exclusion. The distributional profile of retirement savings tax preferences is sharply and persistently regressive, for reasons that are both structural and behavioral. Structurally, the value of a tax deduction increases with the marginal tax rate of the taxpayer, which means that high-income taxpayers who contribute to traditional 401k plans or traditional IRAs receive a larger tax benefit per dollar contributed than low-income taxpayers. A taxpayer in the 37% bracket who contributes $23,000 to a traditional 401k saves $8,510 in federal income taxes. A taxpayer in the 12% bracket who contributes the same amount, which is practically impossible on a low income, saves $2,760. Behaviorally, higher income individuals are far more likely to have access to employer-sponsored retirement plans, far more likely to participate in those plans when they are available, and far more likely to contribute the maximum allowable amount. Federal Reserve data show that approximately 70% of workers in the top income quintile have access to employer-sponsored retirement plans, compared to approximately 25% of workers in the bottom income quintile. Among those with access, participation rates range from approximately 90% in the top quintile to approximately 40% in the bottom quintile. And contribution amounts, as a share of income, are substantially higher among high-income participants. Research by the Tax Policy Center has found that the top quintile of income earners receives approximately 65% of the total benefit of retirement savings tax preferences, while the bottom 40% receives approximately 5%. The Roth account structure, which provides no upfront tax deduction but allows tax-free growth and withdrawal, does not fundamentally alter this distributional picture, because the ability to contribute to Roth accounts and the long-term benefit of tax-free compounding are both advantages that accrue primarily to those with sufficient income to save and sufficient time horizon to benefit from compound growth. The cumulative effect of these individual provisions, the employer health insurance exclusion, the capital gains and dividend preferences, the step-up in basis, the mortgage interest deduction, the retirement savings preferences, and the hundreds of smaller provisions that address education, charitable giving, energy, state and local taxes, and dozens of other policy domains, is a tax code that functions as a massive, hidden, upwardly redistributive welfare state. The tax code subsidizes homeownership, but primarily for affluent homeowners with large mortgages and high marginal tax rates. It subsidizes healthcare, but primarily for employees of large companies with generous benefit packages. It subsidizes retirement savings, but primarily for high-income individuals who can afford to defer current consumption and who benefit from the highest marginal tax rates. Economy itself. The Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, universally known as the GI Bill, represents the single most consequential deliberate act of middle-class subsidization in the history of the United States, and arguably in the history of any democratic nation. Signed into law by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt on June 22, 1944, 16 days after the D-Day invasion of Normandy, while the outcome of the Second World War remained uncertain, the GI Bill was, at its core, a massive government program that provided returning veterans with fully subsidized higher education, federally guaranteed low-interest home mortgages, unemployment compensation, and job training assistance. The scale of the program was unprecedented in American history. By the time the original GI Bill expired in 1956, approximately 7.8 million of the 16 million Americans who served in World War II had used its education benefits, and approximately 4.3 million had used its home loan guarantee program. The federal government paid the full cost of tuition, fees, and books at any college or university that would admit the veteran, plus a monthly living stipend that covered basic expenses, a benefit package that, in inflation-adjusted terms, was worth tens of thousands of dollars per veteran per year. The Home Loan Guarantee Program did not provide the mortgage itself, but guaranteed up to 50% of the loan amount, eliminating the need for a down payment and dramatically reducing the risk to private lenders, which enabled those lenders to offer mortgages at interest rates far below what veterans could have obtained on the open market. The GI Bill did not merely assist returning veterans in transitioning to civilian life. It created the American middle class as a mass phenomenon, a class defined by homeownership, college education, stable employment, and suburban residency through a program of direct, visible, and comprehensive government subsidization that was so successful, so transformative, and so popular that it became the template for every subsequent piece of American social legislation, even and as the mechanisms of subsidization shifted from direct spending to the submerged state structures described in the preceding sections. The political origins of the GI Bill are essential to understanding both its design and its limitations. Limitations that would have profound and enduring consequences for the racial structure of American wealth and opportunity. The bill was drafted primarily by the American Legion, a veterans organization that was determined to avoid the disastrous experience that followed World War I, when returning veterans were promised a bonus that was not paid for more than a decade, leading to the Bonus March of 1932, in which thousands of destitute veterans occupied the National Mall in Washington and were violently dispersed by federal troops under the command of General Douglas MacArthur. The American Legion's national commander, Harry Colmery, wrote the initial draft of the bill in longhand at a hotel in Washington, and the organization lobbied Congress aggressively for its passage. The bill passed both houses of Congress with near unanimous support, a rarity in American legislative history, in part because of genuine gratitude toward returning veterans, in part because of fear of social instability if millions of young men returned from combat to an economy without sufficient jobs, and in part because of the political calculation that a broad-based benefit program for veterans would be more popular and more durable than targeted programs for specific populations. President Roosevelt signed the bill into law with enthusiasm, describing it as a program that would help veterans adjust to civilian life and would prevent the kind of post-war economic dislocation that had contributed to the Great Depression. The education provisions of the GI Bill transformed the American higher education system in ways that were immediate, dramatic, and permanent. Before the war, college education was an elite privilege. In 1940, only about 6% of the adult American population held a bachelor's degree, and college enrollment was heavily concentrated among the children of the upper and upper middle classes. The GI Bill democratized higher education in a single generation by paying the full cost of attendance for any veteran who could gain admission to any accredited institution. The response was overwhelming. In the fall of 1947, veterans constituted approximately 49% of all college admissions in the United States. Universities that had been small regional institutions were flooded with applications and forced to expand their facilities, their faculties, and their curricula to accommodate the influx. The University of Wisconsin's enrollment doubled. The City College of New York, which had historically served the children of working-class immigrants, saw its enrollment surge as veterans from every borough took advantage of the benefit. Stanford, Yale, and Columbia admitted veterans who would never have been considered for admission before the war. Men from working-class families, from rural communities, from immigrant backgrounds, and these men graduated, entered professional careers, and achieved levels of economic success that would have been unimaginable for their parents. By 1956, when the original GI Bill's education benefit expired, approximately 2.2 million veterans had used the benefit to attend college, and an additional 5.6 million had used it for other forms of education and training, vocational programs, on-the-job training, farm training, and high school completion. The federal government's total expenditure on GI Bill education benefits during this period was approximately $14.5 billion, a figure that, in inflation-adjusted terms, represents one of the largest single investments in human capital in the history of any nation. The economic returns on this investment were extraordinary and well documented. A landmark study by economists at the National Bureau of Economic Research estimated that the GI Bill's education benefits generated additional lifetime earnings for beneficiaries that exceeded the program's costs by a factor of approximately 6 to 8. Veterans who used the education benefit earned significantly more over their lifetimes than comparable veterans who did not, and the income gains were concentrated among veterans from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, men who would not have attended college without the subsidy. The program also generated substantial fiscal returns for the government because the higher incomes of GI Bill beneficiaries generated higher tax revenues that more than offset the original cost of the program. A 1988 study commissioned by the Joint Economic Committee of Congress estimated that for every dollar the federal government spent on GI Bill education benefits, the economy received approximately $7 in increased economic output over the following decades. The GI Bill was not merely a social program, it was an investment, a government subsidy to human capital formation that produced returns so large that it is routinely cited by economists as evidence that public investment in education can be enormously productive when it is structured correctly and delivered at sufficient scale. The housing provisions of the GI Bill were equally transformative and, in some respects, even more consequential for the long-term structure of American wealth and class. The Veterans Administration Home Loan Guarantee Program, Title III of the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, did not provide veterans with direct cash grants for home purchases. Instead, it guaranteed a portion of the mortgage loan, thereby reducing the risk to private lenders and enabling those lenders to offer veterans mortgages with no down payment, no private mortgage insurance requirement, and interest rates that were significantly below prevailing market rates. The VA guarantee removed the two most significant barriers to homeownership for young, working-class Americans: the down payment requirement, which could represent years of savings for a family living on modest wages, and the high interest rates that lenders charge to compensate for the risk of lending to borrowers with little equity in the property. By absorbing this risk, the federal government effectively subsidized the entire lending transaction, making it possible for millions of families to purchase homes that they could not have afforded on the open market without government assistance. The impact on the American housing market was immediate and transformative. Before the war, the home ownership rate in the United States was approximately 44%, a figure that had remained remarkably stable for decades. By 1960, the home ownership rate had risen to approximately 62%, an increase of 18 percentage points, representing millions of new homeowners in the span of less than 2 decades. This increase was driven almost entirely by the GI Bill and by the parallel expansion of FHA-insured mortgages under the Federal Housing Administration, which had been established in 1934 as part of the New Deal and which served a similar risk absorption function for non-veteran borrowers. Between 1944 and 1956, the VA guaranteed approximately 4.3 million home loans with a total value of approximately $33 billion. The FHA insured millions of additional mortgages. Together, these two programs accounted for the vast majority of new mortgage originations during the post-war period and were the primary engines of the suburban construction boom that transformed the physical landscape of the United States. The suburban communities that were built to absorb the demand created by GI Bill and FHA mortgages became the physical infrastructure of the new American middle class. Levittown, the iconic planned suburban community built by William Levitt and Sons on Long Island, New York, beginning in 1947, was designed explicitly to serve returning veterans and their families. Levitt used mass production techniques adapted from the assembly line, standardized designs, prefabricated components, specialized work crews that moved from house to house performing a single task, to build homes at a pace of approximately 30 per day and at a price of approximately $7,990 per unit, a price that was specifically calibrated to be affordable under the terms of a VA guaranteed mortgage with no down payment. A veteran could move into a brand new home in Levittown with nothing more than a monthly payment of approximately $58, a payment that was comparable to, and in many cases less than, the rent the veteran had been paying for a crowded apartment in the city. Levittown was not merely a housing development, it was a government-subsidized class formation project, a physical manifestation of the federal government's decision to use public resources to create a new class of property-owning, home-occupying, tax-paying citizens whose economic stability and political loyalty would be anchored by their ownership of a subsidized asset. The wealth-building implications of the GI Bill's housing provisions extended far beyond the initial purchase of the home. Real estate appreciation, the increase in the market value of the property over time, has historically been the single largest source of wealth accumulation for middle-class American families. A veteran who purchased a home in Levittown in 1948 for $7,990 was sitting on a property worth approximately $400,000 to $500,000 by the early 2000s, depending on the specific location and condition of the home. This appreciation, an increase of approximately 5,000 to 6,000%, was not the product of the veteran's labor or investment acumen. It was the product of macroeconomic forces, population growth, inflation, rising incomes, and continued government subsidization of the housing market through the mortgage interest deduction, the GSE system, and Federal Reserve interest rate policy that increased the value of an asset that the veteran had acquired through a government subsidy. The initial GI Bill mortgage guarantee was the seed. The subsequent appreciation was the harvest, and both the seed and the harvest were products of government policy. The veteran who passed this property to his children, or who sold it and used the proceeds to fund his retirement or to help his children purchase homes of their own, was transmitting wealth that originated in a government subsidy, but that was, by this point, perceived as purely private wealth, earned through prudent homeownership and the natural workings of the real estate market. The intergenerational transmission of this subsidized wealth is the mechanism through which the GI Bill's effects persist to the present day, more than 80 years after the bill's passage. And it is the mechanism through which the bill's racial exclusions continue to shape the racial wealth gap. Because the wealth accumulated through GI Bill subsidized homeownership was passed from parents to children through inheritance, gifts, and family financial support, the beneficiaries of the GI Bill are not merely the veterans who used the program, but their children, their grandchildren, and in some cases their great-grandchildren. Research by economists Derek Hamilton and William Darity, building on the foundational work of sociologists Melvin Oliver and Thomas Shapiro in their landmark 1995 book, Black Wealth, White Wealth, has documented the central role of intergenerational wealth transfers, particularly transfers related to homeownership, in explaining the persistent and widening racial wealth gap in the United States. White families are significantly more likely than black families to receive financial assistance from parents for a down payment on a home, for college tuition, for starting a business, or for other wealth-building activities. These transfers are not merely the product of current income differences. They are the accumulated legacy of past wealth accumulation, which was itself heavily shaped by government subsidies, like the GI Bill, from which black families were systematically excluded. The racial exclusions of the GI Bill were not incidental to the program. They were structural, deliberate, and devastating in their long-term consequences. The bill itself did not contain explicit racial restrictions. It was formally race-neutral, offering its benefits to all honorably discharged veterans regardless of race. But the administration of the bill's benefits was delegated to state and local institutions that operated within the framework of Jim Crow segregation in the South and de facto discrimination in the North and West. The education benefit was administered through existing colleges and universities, and in the South, black veterans were restricted to historically black colleges and universities, institutions that were chronically underfunded, had limited capacity, and could not absorb the flood of black veterans seeking to use their benefits. Many black veterans were turned away from HBCUs that were already at capacity, and they were barred from attending white institutions by state segregation laws. In Mississippi, of the approximately 3,200 veterans who used the GI Bill's education benefit at the University of Mississippi in 1946, not a single one was black. Black veterans who could not gain admission to an HBCU were often steered into vocational training programs that led to lower-paying jobs than the college degrees their white counterparts were earning. The result was that the GI Bill's education benefit, the most powerful human capital subsidy in American history, was distributed in a way that dramatically reinforced, rather than reduced, the racial gap in educational attainment and the associated gap in lifetime earnings. The housing provisions were even more explicitly discriminatory in their administration. The VA Home Loan Guarantee Program relied on private lenders to originate the mortgages and on the VA's own appraisal system to determine the value of the properties being purchased. Both the private lenders and the VA appraisers operated within a framework of systematic racial discrimination. The Federal Housing Administration, which had been established a decade before the GI Bill and which served as the institutional model for the VA's mortgage guarantee program, had adopted and codified the practice of residential redlining, the systematic refusal to insure mortgages in neighborhoods with significant black populations. The FHA's underwriting manual, published in 1938 and used as a guide by both FHA and VA appraisers, explicitly stated that the presence of black families in a neighborhood was a negative factor in property valuation and that racially homogeneous neighborhoods were necessary for the protection of property values. The manual recommended the use of restrictive covenants, legal agreements attached to property deeds that prohibited the sale of the property to black buyers, as a tool for maintaining racial homogeneity. These policies were not the product of individual prejudice. They were official federal government policy, implemented by federal agencies, enforced by federal appraisers, and backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government. When black veterans applied for VA-guaranteed mortgages, they were systematically denied, not because the GI Bill excluded them, but because the institutions that administered the GI Bill's benefits were saturated with racial discrimination at every level. The consequences of this discriminatory administration were catastrophic for black wealth accumulation and are directly measurable in the racial wealth gap that persists to this day. In the New York and northern New Jersey suburbs, where the post-war housing boom was most intense, fewer than 100 of the 67,000 mortgages insured by the GI Bill were secured by non-white veterans. In Levittown, which became the symbol of the GI Bill-fueled suburban dream, black veterans were explicitly excluded. William Levitt refused to sell homes to black families, stating publicly that he could be considered as a firm that practices racial discrimination, but defending the policy as a business necessity, arguing that integrating Levittown would drive away white buyers and destroy property values. The VA did not require Levitt or any other developer to sell to black veterans as a condition of participating in the VA Mortgage Guarantee Program. The federal government subsidized the construction of a community from which black citizens were barred, using a program that was nominally available to all veterans regardless of race. This was not a failure of the program, it was a feature of the program as it was actually administered, a feature that channeled the largest middle-class subsidy in American history overwhelmingly toward white families and systematically excluded the black families whose service had earned them the same benefits. The long-term wealth consequences of this exclusion are almost impossible to overstate. The median wealth of white families in the United States is approximately 10 times the median wealth of black families, a ratio that has remained remarkably stable over decades, despite the Civil Rights Revolution, the expansion of educational opportunity, the growth of the black middle class, and decades of anti-discrimination legislation. The primary driver of this gap is not current income. Income gaps between white and black families, while significant, are far smaller than wealth gaps, but accumulated wealth, particularly home ownership wealth, that has compounded across generations. White families that purchased homes through GI Bill subsidized mortgages in the late 1940s and 1950s accumulated decades of home equity appreciation that was then transmitted to their children and grandchildren through inheritance, through financial assistance with down payments and college tuition, and through the intergenerational cultivation of financial knowledge, institutional relationships, and social capital that accompany property ownership. Black families that were excluded from the GI Bill's housing benefits did not merely miss out on the initial subsidy, they missed out on the compounding returns on that subsidy across 3 generations. The gap between what white families accumulated through subsidized homeownership and what black families would have accumulated had they received the same subsidy is, by any reasonable estimate, in the trillions of dollars. This is the shadow of the GI Bill, the dark side of the greatest middle-class subsidy in American history, and it is a shadow that continues to shape the economic landscape of the United States in the 21st century. The GI Bill also established a template for subsequent American social policy that would have profound consequences for the architecture of the subsidy state. The bill demonstrated that massive, universal, or near-universal, government subsidies could be politically popular, economically productive, and socially transformative, but only when they were framed as benefits for a deserving population, in this case, veterans, when they were delivered through private sector intermediaries, banks, universities, employers, rather than through direct government provision, and when they were structured to build assets, homes, education credentials, rather than to provide income support. This template, deserving recipients, private delivery, asset-building orientation, became the dominant model for American social policy in the post-war era and shaped the design of every major government benefit program that followed, from the Federal Highway Act of 1956 to the Higher Education Act of 1965 to the Tax Reform Act of 1986 to the Affordable Care Act of 2010. The template also contained within it the seeds of the submerged state. By delivering government benefits through private intermediaries, the GI Bill model ensured that the government's role would become increasingly invisible over time, as the intermediaries, universities, banks, real estate developers, insurance companies, became the visible face of the benefit, while the government receded into the background. The transition from the visible subsidization of the GI Bill to the invisible subsidization of the submerged state was not a sudden shift, but a gradual evolution driven by the political logic of the GI Bill template. The more benefits were delivered through private channels, the more politically durable they became, because they created private sector constituencies with financial incentives to defend the programs, and the less visible they became to the beneficiaries who received them. The unemployment compensation provisions of the GI Bill, often overlooked in accounts that focus on education and housing, also deserve attention because they illustrate a form of subsidization that was explicitly designed to prevent social instability. The bill provided returning veterans with unemployment compensation of $20 per week for up to 52 weeks, a provision that was colloquially known as the 52-20 Club. The benefit was modest by contemporary standards, but served a critical function during the transition period when millions of veterans were being discharged from the military and seeking civilian employment. Approximately 9 million veterans received some unemployment compensation under this provision at a total cost of approximately $3.8 billion. The provision was explicitly motivated by fear of the kind of mass unemployment and social unrest that had followed World War I and that had contributed to the rise of fascism in Europe. Policymakers understood that 16 million young men returning from combat to an economy that could not absorb them would constitute a social and political crisis of the first order. The GI Bill's unemployment provisions, like its education and housing provisions, were a preemptive investment in social stability, a subsidy to prevent revolution. This dimension of the GI Bill, its function as a social control mechanism, is often obscured by the program's celebratory legacy, but it was explicit in the legislative debate and in the strategic calculations of the policymakers who designed the program. The GI Bill was not merely an expression of gratitude toward veterans. It was a calculated investment in the political stability of the post-war order, funded by the federal government and delivered through a combination of direct payments and private sector intermediaries. The legacy of the GI Bill extends beyond its specific provisions to its broader impact on American attitudes toward government spending, social policy, and the relationship between the state and the individual. The program demonstrated that government subsidization could produce enormous social and economic returns, that public investment in human capital and asset building was not merely charitable but productive, generating economic growth, tax revenue, and social stability that far exceeded the cost of the investment. But the program also demonstrated the limits of universalism in a society structured by racial hierarchy, that a formally race-neutral program could produce racially stratified outcomes when administered through institutions saturated with racial discrimination. And the program established the political template for the submerged state, the principle that government benefits are most politically sustainable when they are delivered through private channels, framed as earned rather than given, and structured to build assets rather than provide income. This template would shape the entire subsequent trajectory of American social policy, from the interstate highway system to the student loan program to the Affordable Care Act, creating a welfare state that is simultaneously one of the most generous in the world when measured by the total resources channeled through the tax code, through government-sponsored enterprises, through regulatory mandates, and through direct spending, and one of the most unequal, because the distribution of those resources is skewed by the same racial, class, and institutional dynamics that shaped the administration of the GI Bill. The vocational training and on-the-job training components of the GI Bill, which were utilized by approximately 5.6 million veterans, far more than the college education component, illuminate a dimension of the subsidy that is often lost in the celebratory narrative focused on college attendance. These provisions allowed veterans to receive government-paid stipends while undergoing apprenticeships, farm training, and vocational education in trades ranging from plumbing and electrical work to auto repair and machining. The economic logic was that not every veteran needed or wanted a college degree, and that the post-war economy required skilled tradesmen as much as it required college-educated professionals. The vocational provisions were administered with even less federal oversight than the education provisions, which created opportunities for abuse, fly-by-night training schools that collected government tuition payments while providing little actual training, farm training programs that were essentially subsidies to landowners who used veteran labor, but also created pathways to stable middle-class employment for millions of veterans who would never have attended college. The plumber, the electrician, the machinist, and the carpenter who built the post-war middle class were, in many cases, trained through GI Bill vocational programs, their skills subsidized by the federal government, their subsequent employment made possible by the construction boom that was itself subsidized by FHA and VA mortgage programs and by the Federal Highway Act. The entire ecosystem of post-war middle-class formation was a subsidized ecosystem, with government money flowing through education institutions into human capital, through mortgage guarantees into housing capital, through infrastructure spending into physical capital, and through unemployment compensation into consumption demand, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of subsidized growth that produced the most broadly shared prosperity in American history. The fiscal architecture of the GI Bill also deserves close examination because it reveals how government subsidies can be structured to generate returns that exceed their costs, a principle that has been largely abandoned in contemporary fiscal policy debates, where government spending is reflexively treated as a cost rather than an investment. The total cost of the original GI Bill, including education benefits, home loan guarantees, unemployment compensation, and administrative expenses, has been estimated at approximately $91 billion in inflation-adjusted terms. The returns on this investment, measured in increased tax revenue from higher-earning veterans, increased economic output from a more skilled workforce, increased property tax revenue from homeowning communities, increased consumer spending from a wealthier and more stable middle class, and decreased social costs from reduced crime, reduced poverty, and reduced demands on public assistance programs, have been estimated at multiples of the original cost. The precise multiplier depends on the methodology and the time horizon, but estimates ranging from 5 to 1 to 8 to 1 are common in the economic literature. The GI Bill demonstrated, with the force of empirical evidence at a national scale, that government subsidy is not inherently wasteful, that when directed toward productive investments in human capital and asset formation, government spending can generate returns that dwarf the initial outlay. This demonstration was so powerful that it should have permanently altered the terms of American fiscal policy debate, establishing the principle that the question is not whether to spend, but what to spend on. Instead, the demonstration was gradually obscured by the ideological ascendancy of anti-government conservatism in the 1970s and 1980s, which treated all government spending as inherently inferior to private sector allocation, and which used the language of fiscal responsibility to oppose public investments that would have generated the same kinds of returns that the GI Bill produced. The international context of the GI Bill is also illuminating because the program was part of a broader post-war settlement visible across the Western democracies, in which governments used massive public spending to construct middle-class societies capable of withstanding the ideological appeal of communism. The Marshall Plan, which channeled approximately $13 billion in American aid to Western European nations between 1948 and 1952, was the international analog of the GI Bill, a program of government subsidization designed to create stable, prosperous capitalist democracies that would be inoculated against revolutionary politics. In Western Europe, the post-war settlement took the form of comprehensive welfare states, universal health care, generous unemployment insurance, publicly funded higher education, subsidized housing, and robust pension systems that were explicitly designed to deliver the material benefits of economic growth to the working and middle classes. In the United States, the post-war settlement took a different form, reflecting the distinctive features of American political culture. Instead of a comprehensive, visible welfare state, the United States built a fragmented, partially visible, partially submerged system of subsidies that delivered comparable benefits but through different channels. The GI Bill was the visible component of this settlement, a direct, acknowledged government program that paid for education and guaranteed mortgages. But as the post-war era progressed, the subsidization mechanism shifted from direct spending to tax expenditures, from government programs to government-sponsored enterprises, from visible transfers to invisible interventions. The GI Bill's housing provisions gave way to the FHA and VA mortgage guarantee programs, which gave way to the GSE secondary mortgage market, which gave way to the mortgage interest deduction and the Fed's MBS purchase programs. The GI Bill's education provisions gave way to the Higher Education Act of 1965, which gave way to the Pell Grant and Stafford Loan programs, which gave way to the education tax credits and 529 savings plans of the contemporary tax code. At each stage, the level of subsidization remained comparable. Indeed, in many cases it increased, but the visibility of the subsidization decreased as the mechanisms became more complex, more intermediated, and more deeply embedded in the structures of private sector transactions. The GI Bill also established a deeply consequential principle in American social policy: the principle that government benefits should be tied to service rather than to citizenship. The GI Bill was not a universal program. It was a program for veterans, for individuals who had earned their benefits through military service and sacrifice. This framing was central to the program's political success, because it allowed supporters to distinguish between the deserving veteran who had earned government assistance through service to the nation and the undeserving recipient of welfare who had not. This distinction between earned benefits and unearned handouts, between deserving and undeserving recipients, between programs that reward contribution and programs that reward need, has been one of the most powerful and enduring frames in American political discourse, and it has been deployed to justify a welfare state that provides generous, well-funded benefits to politically favored populations while providing stingy, stigmatized benefits to the poor. Social Security and Medicare are politically popular because they are framed as earned benefits, recipients paid into the system through payroll taxes and are simply receiving what they are owed. Welfare, food stamps, and Medicaid are politically vulnerable because they are framed as unearned transfers. Recipients have not paid into the system and are receiving something for nothing. The GI Bill established this earned versus unearned framework at the foundational moment of the American welfare state, and every subsequent social policy debate has been conducted within its terms. The framework is not logically coherent. The amount a Social Security recipient receives bears little relation to the amount they paid in, and many GI Bill beneficiaries received benefits worth far more than the economic value of their military service. But it is politically powerful because it maps onto deeply held American values of self-reliance, reciprocity, and the moral significance of work and sacrifice. Understanding the GI Bill is essential not merely as a matter of historical interest, but as a matter of structural analysis, because the patterns established by the GI Bill, the pattern of massive government subsidy delivered through private channels, the pattern of formal universalism undermined by discriminatory administration, the pattern of wealth accumulation compounding across generations for some populations while other populations are excluded from the compounding process, are the patterns that define the American subsidy state to this day. Every subsequent section of this analysis will encounter these patterns in different forms and different contexts. In the student loan system, which subsidizes credential acquisition but stratifies the returns by institutional prestige and family wealth. In the healthcare system, which subsidizes employer-sponsored coverage, but leaves the uninsured and the underinsured to bear the full cost of their own care. In the retirement system, which subsidizes tax-deferred savings but concentrates the benefits among the affluent. In the housing system, which subsidizes homeownership but excludes renters and inflates prices for first-time buyers. And in the capital markets, which subsidize risk-taking by the wealthy through preferential tax treatment and Federal Reserve backstops, while exposing wage earners to the full consequences of economic downturns. The GI Bill is the origin story of the American subsidy state, the moment when the government demonstrated, with overwhelming evidence, that direct, large-scale, publicly funded subsidization could build a middle class from scratch, and then spent the next 8 decades burying that demonstration beneath layers of institutional complexity, ideological obfuscation, and political camouflage designed to ensure that the subsidy would continue flowing while its existence would be systematically denied. The GI Bill is both the greatest achievement and the greatest cautionary tale of the American subsidy state, and understanding it in this dual capacity is the prerequisite for understanding everything that follows. The comparative dimension of the GI Bill's legacy also warrants sustained attention, because the program's success has been selectively invoked by policymakers across the political spectrum to justify programs that share its rhetorical frame, but not its structural ambition. When politicians propose a new GI Bill for the 21st century, whether for climate workers, for teachers, for technology apprentices, or for any other favored population, they invoke the original program's transformative power while ignoring the specific features that made it transformative: its scale, its comprehensiveness, its directness, and its willingness to fully subsidize, rather than merely discount, the cost of education and home ownership. Contemporary proposals for education subsidies, income-based repayment plans for student loans, modest tuition credits delivered through the tax code, partial loan forgiveness programs hedged with eligibility restrictions, bear almost no structural resemblance to the GI Bill, which paid the full cost of tuition at any institution, provided a living stipend sufficient to cover basic expenses, and imposed no repayment obligation whatsoever. The distance between the GI Bill's model of full subsidization and the contemporary model of subsidized debt, in which the government's role is to guarantee or subsidize loans that students must repay from future earnings, bearing the full risk of degree depreciation, labor market disruption, and economic recession, is the distance between a subsidy state that was willing to invest directly in its citizens and a subsidy state that has retreated to the role of financier, providing access to cattle rather than access to opportunity. The GI Bill built the middle class by giving veterans education and homes. The contemporary subsidy state attempts to maintain the middle class by giving workers loans and tax deductions. The difference in generosity is the difference in outcomes, and the difference in outcomes is the defining feature of the contemporary American class structure, in which the middle class is simultaneously subsidized at every turn and increasingly unable to achieve the stability and upward mobility that the GI Bill generation took for granted as the natural product of their own effort, unaware that the natural product was, in fact, the most heavily subsidized economic status in the history of the modern world, a status engineered, financed, and sustained by the federal government from the moment of its creation to the present day, through mechanisms both visible and invisible, both openly acknowledged and systematically, thoroughly, and persistently denied. Government-sponsored enterprises occupy a unique and deeply consequential position in the architecture of the American subsidy state. They are neither fully public nor fully private, but occupy a deliberately constructed twilight zone between government agency and private corporation that allows them to channel the credit of the United States government to specific sectors of the economy while maintaining the institutional appearance of private market actors. The term government-sponsored enterprise, or GSE, refers to a category of federally chartered, privately owned financial institutions that were created by acts of Congress to serve specific public policy purposes, primarily the expansion of credit availability in the housing and agricultural sectors, and that benefit from an implicit or explicit government guarantee that reduces their borrowing costs, expands their access to capital, and allows them to dominate the markets in which they operate. The most consequential GSEs in the American economy are Fannie Mae, formerly the Federal National Mortgage Association, established in 1938, Freddie Mac, formerly the Federal Home Loan Mortgage Corporation, established in 1970, the Federal Home Loan Bank System, established in 1932, the Farm Credit System, established in 1916, and, to a lesser extent, entities like the Student Loan Marketing Association, known as Sallie Mae, which was established as a GSE in 1972 and privatized in 2004, but whose legacy continues to shape the student loan market. These entities collectively hold or guarantee more than $11 trillion in financial assets, a sum that exceeds the GDP of every country on Earth except the United States and China, and they do so with the backing, implicit or explicit, of the American taxpayer. The GSE system is the hidden plumbing of the American subsidy state, the pipes through which government-subsidized capital flows from the Treasury and the Federal Reserve to the banks, the mortgage lenders, the farmers, and ultimately the consumers who are the end beneficiaries of the subsidy, all while maintaining the institutional fiction that these capital flows are the product of private market activity rather than government intervention. The history of Fannie Mae illustrates the pattern through which GSEs are created, how they evolve, and how the subsidy they embody becomes progressively more invisible over time, even as it grows in scale. Fannie Mae was established in 1938 as a government agency within the Federal Housing Administration, itself a creature of the New Deal, established just 4 years earlier. Its original purpose was to provide a secondary market for FHA-insured mortgages, to purchase mortgages from local banks and savings institutions, thereby replenishing their capital and enabling them to make additional mortgage loans. The creation of a secondary mortgage market was a revolutionary innovation in housing finance because it severed the link between local deposits and local lending. Before Fannie Mae, a bank in a rapidly growing community could lend only as much as it could attract in deposits from its local customer base. If demand for mortgages exceeded local deposits, the bank had no additional source of funds. By purchasing mortgages from these banks, Fannie Mae injected capital from national and international credit markets into local housing markets, ensuring that mortgage credit was available wherever demand existed, regardless of local savings rates. This function was enormously important for the post-war housing boom, when demand for mortgage credit in rapidly growing suburban communities far exceeded the deposit base of local lending institutions. Fannie Mae was, in this initial phase, an explicit government agency performing an explicit government function, subsidizing the housing market by providing liquidity to mortgage lenders, and its role was widely understood and openly acknowledged. The critical transformation occurred in 1968 when President Lyndon Johnson, seeking to reduce the apparent size of the federal budget in the context of mounting fiscal pressure from the Vietnam War and Great Society programs, privatized Fannie Mae, converting it from a government agency to a privately owned, publicly traded corporation with a federal charter. This privatization was a masterpiece of fiscal illusion. By removing Fannie Mae from the federal budget, the Johnson administration reduced the reported federal deficit by the amount of Fannie Mae's outstanding obligations, billions of dollars that simply disappeared from the budget without any change in the underlying economic reality. Fannie Mae continued to perform the identical function it had always performed, purchasing mortgages from banks and providing liquidity to the housing market, but it was now classified as a private corporation rather than a government agency. Its debt was no longer counted as government debt. Its obligations were no longer counted as government obligations. And yet, everyone in the financial markets understood that Fannie Mae continued to enjoy an implicit government guarantee, that the federal government would not allow Fannie Mae to fail because its failure would devastate the housing market and trigger a financial crisis. This implicit guarantee was never formally enacted by Congress and was never officially acknowledged by any administration. It existed in the twilight zone of market expectations, an understanding so universal and so deeply embedded in the pricing of Fannie Mae's debt that it was, for all practical purposes, indistinguishable from an explicit guarantee. The implicit guarantee allowed Fannie Mae to borrow at interest rates only slightly above those paid by the U.S. Treasury itself, rates far below what any private corporation of comparable size and risk profile could achieve. The difference between what Fannie Mae actually paid to borrow and what it would have paid without the implicit guarantee was the subsidy, a subsidy worth billions of dollars per year, paid for by the American taxpayer's assumption of risk, and captured by Fannie Mae's shareholders, executives, and the homeowners who benefited from lower mortgage rates. Freddie Mac was created in 1970 through the Emergency Home Finance Act, signed by President Richard Nixon, to perform a function similar to Fannie Mae, but focused on the conventional mortgage market rather than the FHA-insured market. Together, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac came to dominate the American mortgage market to an extraordinary degree. By the mid-2000s, the two entities owned or guaranteed approximately half of all outstanding residential mortgage debt in the United States, a portfolio of more than $5 trillion. Their combined annual mortgage purchases exceeded the total GDP of most nations. They were the largest single source of demand for mortgage-backed securities, the largest single holders of mortgage credit risk, and the most systemically important financial institutions in the American economy. And they operated with a degree of leverage, the ratio of their obligations to their capital, that would have been considered reckless for any private financial institution. In 2007, on the eve of the financial crisis, Fannie Mae held approximately $80 billion in capital against approximately $5.4 trillion in mortgage obligations, a leverage ratio of approximately 67 to 1. For comparison, the largest commercial banks, which were themselves considered over-leveraged, operated at leverage ratios of approximately 15 to 1 to 30 to 1. Fannie Mae's extraordinary leverage was possible only because of the implicit government guarantee, which assured its creditors that they would be made whole regardless of the company's financial condition. The leverage was itself a product of the subsidy. The guarantee reduced Fannie Mae's cost of capital, which increased its profitability, which incentivized its management and shareholders to maximize leverage in order to maximize the return on equity, knowing that the downside risk was borne by the taxpayer rather than by the shareholders. The collapse of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac in September 2008 and the subsequent government bailout represents the most dramatic and expensive demonstration of the GSE subsidy in American history. As the housing bubble inflated during the 2003 to 2007 period, Fannie and Freddie expanded their exposure to subprime and Alt-A mortgages, loans made to borrowers with weaker credit profiles, lower down payments, and less documentation of income and assets. This expansion was driven by a combination of factors: political pressure from Congress to expand homeownership to underserved populations, competitive pressure from Wall Street securitizers who were aggressively entering the mortgage market, and the profit incentive of Fannie and Freddie's shareholders and executives who stood to gain enormous personal wealth from the expansion of the company's portfolios. When housing prices began to decline in 2007 and mortgage defaults began to rise, the thin capital cushions of both entities were rapidly eroded. By September 2008, both companies were effectively insolvent, their liabilities exceeded their assets, and the federal government, through the Federal Housing Finance Agency, placed them into conservatorship. The Treasury Department committed to providing up to $200 billion in capital support for each entity, a commitment that was later made unlimited for a period, representing the largest blank check ever written by the U.S. government to any entity. The total amount of taxpayer capital injected into Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac ultimately reached approximately $190 billion. A sum that exceeded the GDP of many nations and that constituted the single largest corporate bailout in American history. The companies subsequently returned to profitability, in large part because the Fed's zero interest rate policy and MBS purchase programs reflated the housing market, and they have since remitted more than $300 billion in dividends to the Treasury, a fact that defenders of the GSE model cite as evidence that the bailout was not ultimately costly to taxpayers, but that, as with the Fed's emergency lending, confuses ex-post recovery with ex-ante subsidization. The bailout of Fannie and Freddie exposed the implicit guarantee for what it had always been: an explicit government commitment to absorb the losses of these entities, regardless of the scale or origin of those losses. The fiction of private market operation was revealed as fiction. The $190 billion bailout was not an extraordinary intervention in an otherwise private market. It was the inevitable consequence of a system in which private actors were allowed to capture the profits of government-subsidized risk-taking while the losses were socialized to the taxpayer. The GSE model is, in its essence, a system for privatizing gains and socializing losses, for channeling government-subsidized capital to private shareholders and executives during good times while transferring the costs of failure to the public during bad times. This asymmetry is the defining feature of the GSE subsidy, and it has been recognized and criticized by economists, regulators, and policymakers for decades. The Government Accountability Office, the Congressional Budget Office, and academic economists, including Dwight Jaffe, Matthew Richardson, Stein van Nieuwenburg, and Lawrence White, have all published analyses demonstrating the existence and quantifying the cost of the GSE subsidy. Estimates of the annual value of the implicit guarantee, measured as the difference between Fannie and Freddie's actual borrowing costs and the costs they would face as fully private entities without any government backing, have ranged from approximately $6 billion to $23 billion per year, depending on the methodology, the time period, and the assumptions about what a fully private entity's borrowing costs would be. A portion of this subsidy was passed through to mortgage borrowers in the form of lower mortgage rates. Estimates suggest approximately 1/3 to 2/3 of the subsidy was passed through, with the remainder captured by Fannie and Freddie's shareholders in the form of higher profits and by their executives in the form of higher compensation. In the years preceding the financial crisis, the CEOs of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac earned annual compensation packages ranging from $12 million to $25 million, compensation levels that reflected the profitability of institutions that were borrowing at government-subsidized rates and deploying the proceeds in a market where their government charter gave them a structural competitive advantage over any private competitor. The Federal Home Loan Bank system, often overlooked in discussions of GSEs because it operates at a level of institutional plumbing that is invisible to virtually all Americans, is nonetheless one of the most consequential subsidy mechanisms in the American financial system. Established in 1932 by the Federal Home Loan Bank Act, signed by President Herbert Hoover in the depth of the Great Depression, the system consists of 11 regional federal home loan banks that provide collateralized loans, called advances, to their member institutions, which include commercial banks, savings institutions, credit unions, and insurance companies. The FHL banks are cooperatively owned by their member institutions, and they fund their lending operations by issuing debt in the capital markets. Debt that, like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac's debt, benefits from an implicit government guarantee that reduces borrowing costs far below what any comparably rated private institution could achieve. The total assets of the Federal Home Loan Bank system exceeded $1.1 trillion as of recent reports, and the system's outstanding advances to member institutions routinely exceed $700 billion. These advances provide a critical source of funding for the member institutions, which use the proceeds to make mortgage loans, to fund other lending activities, and to manage their liquidity positions. The advances are cheaper than alternative funding sources, cheaper than deposits, cheaper than interbank borrowing, cheaper than issuing corporate debt, because the implicit government guarantee on FHL bank debt reduces the interest rate that investors demand. This reduction in funding cost is a subsidy, and it flows from the American taxpayer's assumption of the risk of FHL bank default to the member institutions that borrow from the FHL banks, and, through those institutions, to the consumers and businesses that receive loans funded by FHL bank advances. The Farm Credit System, established in 1916 by the Federal Farm Loan Act signed by President Woodrow Wilson, represents the oldest GSE in the American financial system and illustrates how government-sponsored credit allocation to a specific economic sector can become a permanent and politically untouchable feature of the subsidy landscape. The Farm Credit System consists of a network of lending institutions, farm credit banks, the Federal Farm Credit Banks Funding Corporation, and approximately 60 local lending associations that provide credit to farmers, ranchers, agricultural cooperatives, rural utilities, and rural homebuyers. Like other GSEs, the Farm Credit System funds its lending by issuing debt in the capital markets. And like other GSEs, its debt benefits from an implicit government guarantee that reduces its borrowing costs and gives it a competitive advantage over private agricultural lenders. The total assets of the Farm Credit System exceeded $450 billion in recent years, with approximately $390 billion in outstanding loans. The system finances approximately 40% of all farm real estate debt and approximately 30% of all short and intermediate-term agricultural credit in the United States. The subsidy embedded in the Farm Credit System, the difference between the interest rates it charges farmers and the rates those farmers would pay to borrow from fully private lenders without government backing, has been estimated at approximately $1 to $2 billion per year. This subsidy flows primarily to large-scale agricultural operations, because the largest borrowers receive the largest loans and therefore capture the largest share of the interest rate subsidy. Research has consistently shown that the Farm Credit System's benefits are concentrated among the wealthiest and most land-rich farming operations, a distributional pattern that is consistent with the broader pattern of American subsidies flowing disproportionately to those who least need them. The GSE model represents a particular form of government intervention that is distinctive to the American political economy, and that reflects the unique features of American political culture. Specifically, the preference for government action that operates through private sector channels rather than through direct government provision. In a European social democratic context, the government's desire to expand mortgage credit availability would likely be addressed through a government-owned lending institution, a national mortgage bank that would make loans directly to home buyers, funded by government bonds, and operated by government employees. In the American context, this direct approach was considered politically unacceptable because it would have constituted visible government intervention in a market that was ideologically designated as private. Instead, the American approach was to create entities that looked and operated like private corporations, with shareholders, boards of directors, executive compensation packages, and stock market listings, but that were backed by the government's credit and regulated by government agencies, and that served government-designated policy objectives. This hybrid model allowed the government to achieve its policy goals: expanded credit availability, lower borrowing costs, broader home ownership, without appearing to engage in the kind of direct government provision that American political culture found objectionable. The GSEs were, in this sense, an institutional expression of the American preference for invisible subsidy, government intervention disguised as private market activity, government subsidy disguised as corporate finance, government risk-bearing disguised as private enterprise. The consequences of this institutional design have been profound and, in many cases, perverse. The hybrid structure of GSEs creates a fundamental incentive problem that economists call the heads I win tails you lose dynamic. When GSEs are profitable, The profits accrue to private shareholders who had no role in creating the government guarantee that makes the profits possible. When GSEs incur losses, the losses are absorbed by the government, which is to say, by the taxpayer, because the implicit guarantee prevents the entities from failing in the normal sense. This asymmetry distorts the behavior of GSE managers and shareholders in predictable and well-documented ways. It encourages excessive risk-taking because the upside of risk is captured privately, while the downside is socialized publicly. It encourages excessive leverage because the government guarantee reduces the cost of debt and thereby increases the return on equity. And it encourages the cultivation of political relationships to protect the GSE's charter and its implicit guarantee, because the charter and the guarantee are the source of the entity's competitive advantage and therefore the source of its profitability. The political activities of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac in the decades preceding the financial crisis were legendary in Washington. The two entities maintained some of the largest lobbying operations in the Capitol, employed former members of Congress and senior government officials as executives and board members, made substantial campaign contributions to members of the congressional committees that oversaw them, funded academic research that supported the GSE model, and cultivated relationships with community organizations and affordable housing advocates who would mobilize political support against any threat to the entity's charter or privileges. The total lobbying and political expenditures of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac in the decade preceding the crisis have been estimated at approximately $200 million, an investment that proved extraordinarily effective in preventing legislative reform of the GSE model until the crisis rendered reform impossible to avoid. The conservatorship of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which has now persisted for nearly 2 decades with no resolution, represents one of the most remarkable episodes of institutional limbo in American governance. The two entities continue to operate, continue to guarantee mortgages, continue to dominate the secondary mortgage market, and continue to remit their profits to the Treasury. But they have no private shareholders with meaningful economic interests, no defined path to either reprivatization or full nationalization, and no permanent legislative framework governing their future. They exist in a state of indefinite suspended animation, too important to shut down, too politically toxic to reform, and too profitable for the Treasury to release. The absence of reform reflects the political power of the status quo. Every stakeholder in the current system, the mortgage industry, the real estate industry, the consumer advocacy community, the Treasury Department, and the existing regulatory apparatus, has an interest in maintaining the current arrangement, which provides government-subsidized mortgage credit at scale without requiring any politician to vote for a visible government subsidy. The conservatorship is, in this sense, the ultimate expression of the American preference for invisible subsidy, a system in which the government owns and operates the two largest participants in the largest credit market in the world, while maintaining the institutional pretense that these entities are private corporations in temporary receivership. The fiction is sustained because the fiction serves the interests of every participant. The government gets the mortgage market functioning and the profit remittances. The mortgage industry gets the subsidized secondary market. The home buyers get lower rates, and the taxpayer bears the risk of the entire edifice collapsing again, a risk that is real, that is quantifiable, and that is systematically excluded from the federal budget because the accounting conventions for GSEs treat the government's contingent liabilities as though they do not exist until they materialize. The broader lesson of the GSE system for the architecture of invisible subsidy is that institutional design matters as much as policy substance. The decision to deliver housing subsidies through government-sponsored enterprises rather than through direct government lending created a set of institutional dynamics: the privatization of gains, the socialization of losses, the cultivation of political protection, the obscuring of the government's fiscal exposure, that are direct consequences of the GSE structure and that would not exist under alternative institutional designs. A government-owned national mortgage bank, for example, would deliver similar subsidies to home buyers, lower mortgage rates, broader credit availability, but would do so transparently, with the subsidy appearing as an explicit line item in the federal budget and the government's risk exposure appearing as an explicit liability on the government's balance sheet. The GSE model achieves the same economic result, subsidized mortgage credit, while hiding both the cost and the risk behind a screen of corporate governance and market-based language. This hiding is not incidental to the model, it is the model's primary political function. The GSE system exists not because it is the most efficient way to deliver housing subsidies, the evidence on efficiency is ambiguous at best, but because it is the most politically sustainable way to deliver housing subsidies in a political culture that is hostile to visible government intervention in markets. The GSEs are institutional expressions of the American preference for subsidy without acknowledgement, intervention without visibility, government without government, and their history, their structure, and their recurring crises illuminate the costs and contradictions of that preference with exceptional clarity. The implications of the GSE model extend beyond housing and agriculture to every domain of the American economy in which the government seeks to direct capital without appearing to do so. The student loan market, which will be examined in detail in subsequent sections, was originally structured through a GSE, Sallie Mae, that performed a function analogous to Fannie Mae's role in the mortgage market, purchasing student loans from originating lenders, thereby providing liquidity and expanding credit availability. The government-sponsored enterprise model has been proposed at various points for small business lending, infrastructure finance, renewable energy investment, and export credit. In each case, the appeal of the GSE model is the same. It allows the government to subsidize a favored sector while maintaining the appearance of private market operation. And in each case, the risks of the model are the same: the privatization of profits, the socialization of losses, the distortion of risk-taking incentives, the cultivation of political constituencies that resist reform, and the systematic obscuring of the government's fiscal exposure. The GSE system is not merely a set of specific institutions, it is a template for how the American government intervenes in the economy, a template that prioritizes invisibility over transparency, political sustainability over democratic accountability, and institutional preservation over institutional reform. Understanding this template is essential to understanding the hidden architecture of the American subsidy state, because the template has been replicated, adapted, and extended across virtually every domain of American economic policy, creating a web of government-backed, privately operated institutions that channel trillions of dollars in subsidized capital to favored sectors, favored populations, and favored political constituencies, while maintaining the ideological fiction that the American economy is fundamentally a private market system in which the government plays a limited and subordinate role. The technical mechanics of how GSEs actually transmit their subsidy to the end consumer deserve far more granular attention than they typically receive, because the transmission mechanism is where the subsidy becomes invisible, where government credit backing is alchemized into a consumer product that feels entirely private. Consider the specific chain of transactions through which a Fannie Mae guarantee translates into a lower mortgage rate for a homebuyer in suburban Ohio. The homebuyer approaches a local bank or mortgage company, say a regional lender like Fifth Third Bank or a national originator like Rocket Mortgage, and applies for a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage. The lender underwrites the loan according to Fannie Mae's published underwriting guidelines that specify acceptable credit scores, debt-to-income ratios, loan-to-value ratios, documentation requirements, and property types. If the loan conforms to these guidelines, it is eligible for sale to Fannie Mae. The lender originates the loan, collects an origination fee, and then sells the loan to Fannie Mae, typically within days or weeks of closing. Fannie Mae pays the lender approximately the face value of the loan, sometimes at a slight premium or discount depending on the interest rate and market conditions, and the lender uses the proceeds to originate additional mortgages. Fannie Mae then pools the purchase loan with thousands of other conforming loans and issues a mortgage-backed security, guaranteed by Fannie Mae, that represents a claim on the cash flows from the pooled mortgages. This security is sold to investors, pension funds, insurance companies, mutual funds, foreign central banks, sovereign wealth funds, who are willing to accept a relatively low yield because Fannie Mae's guarantee means they bear no credit risk on the underlying mortgages. If a homeowner in the pool defaults, Fannie Mae absorbs the loss and continues to make payments to the investors. The investors are, in effect, lending money to American homebuyers, but they are doing so through a government-guaranteed intermediary that eliminates the credit risk that would otherwise require a higher yield, and therefore a higher mortgage rate. At every link in this chain, the GSE guarantee reduces costs. The lender faces less risk in holding the loan because it knows it can sell the loan to Fannie Mae. The lender, therefore, requires a smaller risk premium from the borrower. Fannie Mae can issue mortgage-backed securities at yields only slightly above Treasury yields because investors treat the securities as near sovereign credit. The low yield on MBS translates directly into lower mortgage rates for borrowers. Research by Federal Reserve economists and academic scholars has estimated that the GSE guarantee reduces mortgage rates by approximately 25 to 50 basis points relative to what rates would be in a fully private securitization market without any government backing. On a $350,000 mortgage, a 40 basis point reduction in the interest rate saves the borrower approximately $85 per month, or approximately $30,600 over the life of a 30-year loan. This is the subsidy, invisible, automatic, embedded in the structure of the transaction, and experienced by the borrower not as a government benefit, but as a competitive mortgage rate offered by a private lender. The borrower never interacts with Fannie Mae, never sees Fannie Mae's name on any document they sign at closing, and in most cases has never heard of Fannie Mae, or has only the vaguest notion of what it does. The government has subsidized their home purchase by tens of thousands of dollars, and they have no idea. The guarantee fee, the price Fannie Mae charges lenders for its guarantee, is the nominal cost of this subsidy, and its structure reveals the political economy of GSE pricing. The guarantee fee averaged approximately 25 to 55 basis points during the pre-crisis period and was increased to approximately 50 to 70 basis points after the crisis, in part to recoup taxpayer losses, and in part to level the competitive playing field with private securitizers. But the guarantee fee is not a market price. It is an administered price set by the FHFA, Fannie Mae's regulator, with input from Congress and the Treasury. The fee is set below the level that a private guarantor would charge for the same guarantee because a private guarantor would need to hold substantially more capital to absorb potential losses and would need to earn a market return on that capital. The difference between the GSE guarantee fee and the hypothetical private guarantee fee is the net subsidy, the amount by which the government's willingness to bear mortgage credit risk reduces the cost of that risk relative to private alternatives. This net subsidy is what flows through to borrowers in the form of lower mortgage rates, and it is financed by the taxpayer's contingent liability, the risk that a housing downturn will generate losses that exceed Fannie Mae's capital, and that must be absorbed by the Treasury, as occurred in 2008. The taxpayer is, in effect, providing catastrophic insurance to the mortgage market at a below-market premium, and the beneficiaries of this below-market insurance are the home buyers who enjoy lower rates, the lenders who earn origination fees on a higher volume of loans, the real estate industry that profits from higher home prices and transaction volumes, and the investors who hold government-guaranteed securities yielding more than treasuries but carrying comparable credit risk. The Federal Home Loan Bank system operates through a different mechanism but achieves a similar result: the subsidization of mortgage lending through government-backed credit intermediation. Unlike Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which purchase mortgages and issue mortgage-backed securities, the Federal Home Loan Banks provide collateralized loans, advances, to their member institutions, which include approximately 6,500 commercial banks, savings institutions, credit unions, and insurance companies. The advances are secured by mortgage collateral. The member institution pledges its mortgage portfolio, government securities, or other eligible collateral to the FHL Bank, and the FHL Bank lends against that collateral at rates that are significantly below the member's alternative funding sources. The FHL Banks fund these advances by issuing consolidated obligations, bonds sold in the capital markets that are the joint and several obligations of all 11 FHL banks and that benefit from the same implicit government guarantee enjoyed by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. This guarantee allows the FHL banks to borrow at rates only marginally above Treasury yields, typically 10 to 30 basis points, and to lend to their members at rates that incorporate a small spread above their own borrowing cost. The members then use the low-cost FHL bank advances to fund mortgage lending and other activities. The subsidy chain is longer than the Fannie Mae chain: government guarantee to FHL bank debt, to low-cost FHL bank funding, to low-cost FHL bank advances, to low-cost member funding, to lower lending rates. But the economic logic is identical. The government's credit reduces the cost of funding at each stage of the chain, and the cumulative reduction is passed through in varying degrees to the end borrower. The FHL bank system also performs a critical liquidity function that became dramatically visible during the 2023 banking crisis, when the failure of Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank triggered widespread concern about the stability of regional and community banks. In the weeks preceding and following these failures, FHL Bank advances surged by more than $300 billion as member institutions drew on their FHL Bank credit lines to shore up their liquidity positions. The FHL banks, in turn, issued massive volumes of consolidated obligations to fund these advances, obligations that the market absorbed without difficulty because of the implicit government guarantee. The FHL bank system functioned, in effect, as a shadow lender of last resort, providing emergency liquidity to stressed banks through a mechanism that was faster, less stigmatized, and less transparent than borrowing from the Federal Reserve's discount window. This shadow lender of last resort function is itself a subsidy. It provides member institutions with a backup liquidity source that reduces their funding risk and allows them to operate with less liquidity than they would need to maintain in the absence of FHL bank access. The existence of this backstop, like the Fed's lender of last resort function, creates moral hazard because institutions that know they can access FHL bank funding in a crisis have less incentive to maintain adequate liquidity buffers during normal times. The 2023 episode revealed that several of the banks that failed or came under severe stress had been heavy borrowers from the FHL banks in the months preceding their failure, using FHL bank advances to fund the deposit outflows that signaled their deteriorating condition. The FHL bank advances, in these cases, did not prevent the crisis. They delayed it, allowing the banks to continue operating in an increasingly precarious condition while the ultimate losses accumulated. The taxpayer-backed FHL bank system was, in effect, providing subsidized financing to banks that were in the process of failing, a perverse outcome that is a direct consequence of the GSE model's structural incentive problems. The political economy of GSE reform, or more precisely, the political economy of the persistent failure to reform the GSE system, illuminates a pattern that recurs throughout the architecture of the American subsidy state, the pattern of institutional entrenchment through constituency cultivation. Each of the major GSEs has, over the decades of its existence, cultivated a network of beneficiaries, allies, and dependents that constitutes a formidable political coalition against reform. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac cultivated relationships with community organizations, affordable housing advocates, civil rights groups, realtors, home builders, mortgage bankers, and commercial bankers, a coalition so broad and so politically diverse that any proposal to reduce the GSES role in the housing market faced opposition from both the left, which feared reduced access to mortgage credit for underserved communities, and the right, which feared disruption to a functioning housing finance system. The federal home loan banks are cooperatively owned by their member institutions, the nation's banks, credit unions, and insurance companies, which gives them a built-in political constituency of thousands of financial institutions spread across every congressional district in the country. The farm credit system is embedded in the political economy of rural America, where its lending supports agricultural operations that are the economic foundation of hundreds of congressional districts and dozens of Senate seats. Each of these constituencies has a direct financial interest in the continuation of the GSE subsidy, and each is capable of mobilizing politically to defend that interest. The result is that the GSE system, despite its recognized flaws, the moral hazard, the taxpayer risk, the distributional regressivity, the opacity, the chronic resistance to reform, persists essentially unchanged, sustained not by any affirmative argument for its superiority, but by the accumulated political power of the constituencies it has created. The GSEs are, in this sense, self-perpetuating subsidy machines, institutions whose primary function, from a political economy perspective, is to generate the political support necessary for their own continuation, and whose secondary function is to channel subsidized capital to the sectors and populations they were created to serve. This inversion of primary and secondary functions, the elevation of institutional self-preservation above policy purpose, is not unique to GSEs. It is a general feature of subsidy institutions in the American political economy, and it will recur in every subsequent section of this analysis, from the student loan system to the agricultural subsidy complex to the insurance industry to the venture capital ecosystem. The GSEs are the institutional template for this pattern, and their history, from creation to expansion to crisis to bailout to indefinite conservatorship, is the archetypal narrative of American subsidy policy, a narrative in which the government creates an institution to solve a problem. The institution grows until it becomes the problem. The government rescues the institution at taxpayer expense, and the cycle continues indefinitely because the political constituencies created by the institution prevent the fundamental restructuring that would break the cycle. This is the hidden plumbing of the American subsidy state, and it leaks profusely, expensively, and always in the same direction.